Helldivers is undeniably one of the most memorable games in my lifetime, not only because of the unyielding success it has brought me in the past year, but also for the sheer passion that can be seen behind every corner of the game. Whatever your opinion about it may be, Helldivers takes place in a beautiful, extensive, and detailed world.
This video will compile every video I've made thus far to make an as solid as possible listening experience for you, the viewer. With that being said, enjoy this complete biological analysis of Helldivers 2. Except for the cultists, because of course they drop 3 days before this video comes out. Let's refresh ourselves on the basics of the Terminids. They are a race of millions of different bugs that are presumably most similar to ants on Earth. That is, if you gave ants 20 different types of super steroids and threw them into the void of space. Now, there are a few main pillars that the Terminids operate on. For one, spores. Terminids love spores. It's how they get around from planet to planet, which is interesting as biological organisms and the all-knowing void of space aren't exactly known to be on good terms with each other. But it can happen sometimes. The first thing coming to mind, of course, is water bears, who can survive the void of space for short times due to its impressive survivability. Who's to say that Terminid spores do not have some kind of jacked up version of this survivability? I presume that the Terminid spores work by getting into a state of inactiveness when in the void of space. Then they hit a survivable atmosphere, a chemical in that atmosphere will interact with the spore and activate it. These spores then presumably grow up into something like eggs, which hatch terminids, which breed, which produce more eggs, which hatch more terminids, etc., and that's the basics of the terminid life cycle based on my research. Additionally, some agree with the theory that you can discern the terminid's sex based on the color scheme they follow, that is to say orange bugs being male and green bugs being female. This definitely falls more into speculation though, as most bug species, from Earth at least, operate on a mostly all-female basis, with few males littering their populations. The different color schemes of bugs could be interpreted as different castes in their social structure. Castes are generally defined as groups of individuals within the same species of social insects that have a different appearance, with that appearance usually going to serve their hive or colony. These green and orange bugs all follow their own line of development. There are several paths that they can take. One of the most common being scavenger becomes warrior, becomes hive guard, becomes charger, becomes behemoth. This path is only a single example out of several diverging and converging paths, with some even combining the green and orange color schemes, which I'll get to way later in this video, with units such as the spore charger or nursing spewer. I'm not going to list every path here, but I have made a hopefully easy to read diagram which shows my interpretations of these paths of development. As for the rest of the basics, of course, Terminids produce element 710 upon death, or as I'd like to call it, space oil, which Super Earth uses to power their Alcubierre drives, which is what allows them for faster than light travel. Otherwise, we can assume that the Terminids are standard organisms, being carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, good old insects. Now, I'll be organizing the ways that I present the different organisms in this video into tiers, and the first of those tiers on the list is the Terminids scavenger tier. The first organism of the scavenger tier is, well, the scavenger. It's a small bug with a hard chitin shell that has 6 small appendages, 4 that are primarily used for walking, and 2 in the front which it can raise to attack its enemies with. These 2 front appendages have an extra spike coming down from them for, well, obvious reasons. Now, these spikes on their pincers may seem insignificant, but they are actually seriously important to looking at the evolution of the different terminid forms, that is. No joke, this will actually come up a bunch of times in later organisms. Another important detail is the scavenger's mouth. From it, we can obviously tell that the Terminids are herbivore. No, obviously they're carnivores. No surprise there. But what's interesting are these 2 curved spikes around their mouth. Again, these will be important in showcasing the consistency behind the different Terminid castes. Otherwise, I'd call the scavenger your standard little guy. They're laughably weak. That is until 17 of them show up while a charger's on your tail, or until a single one of them calls for mama and suddenly the entire hive is right around the corner, but otherwise, a shot from just about any gun, or even a whack from the hilt of any gun, should be enough to put these guys out of commission with relative ease. As for the other 2 organisms in the scavenger tier, the bile spitter and pouncer, they are more or less identical, with their only separating features being the features that separate entire castes. Important note here, for the sake of simplicity, I will now be referring to the 3 main castes as the warrior caste, the bile caste, and the hunter caste. With that being said, the scavenger tier's entry into the bile caste is the bile spitter, which is essentially the same as the scavenger with the double spiked front pincers and the curved spikes around its mouth. It is primarily different with its dark gray shell color and, of course, the bright green pustules and the abdomen. These are filled with bile, which allows the bile spitter to, get this, spit bile. Yes, I know, I'll take the Nobel Prize, as well as explode into bile upon death. Now, one would immediately assume that the bile is something akin to a Terminid's stomach acid. I don't think this is the case though, as if it were so, the rest of the Terminids would look a lot greener than they are now. In truth, I believe it's a separate acidic compound that this caste of Terminid produces for the purpose of defending their colonies at range. On a theoretical home planet, these Terminids would employ strategies similar to those that ants on Earth using formic acid would use, although on a much grander scale. See, certain ants will spray this tiny little acid when they feel threatened by something. This is obviously quite the effective strategy, the biological equivalent to bringing a gun to a sword fight, if you will. And I presume that the Terminids must have had competing species on this theoretical originating planet, which made an evolutionary need for this kind of unit. Now, as I said, this would only take place on a theoretical home planet, and that's because the existence of the Terminids as we know them today is actually attributed to Super Earth itself. See, Super Earth likes space oil. Like, a lot of space oil. And so, in the time between the First and Second Galactic War, bugs, as they were previously named, were farmed for the space oil that the decomposition of their body produced. However, this resulted in forms completely different to that of the forms seen in Helldivers 1, and the bile caste is among these ranks. It was entirely unseen in the previous game. Now, what could this imply for the bile that the Terminids produce? Well, maybe instead of a kind of formic acid like with earth ants, this bile could be E710 itself, only being chemically modified by the biology of the bile Terminids to be offensive in nature. But how do the bile Terminids house this bile without melting into a pile of Terminid slop? Well, that's where I believe the altered color of their armor comes in. You see, I believe that the shells of the bile Terminids are dark gray in coloration because they have a property that is resistant to the bile itself. This property likely extends to all parts of the bile Terminid, but uniquely interacts with their shells, which ultimately makes them a darker color. The Pouncer, on the other hand, contrasts this. Its shell is a much lighter color, which I can only assume is a form of camouflage for bright or sandy environments. It's the Scavenger tier's entry into the Hunter caste, and thus it has wings, and something which many may not have noticed, it actually doesn't have the double-spiked pincers. Rather, its pincers are sickle-shaped, which I assume is an adaptation that allows it to be more effective when attacking from the air. It may also play a part in the organism that is the pinnacle of its evolution, but we will cross that bridge when we get there. For now, the Pouncer is just a standard Scavenger tier enemy with the ability to easily and accurately close the distance to melee range. And now's a great time to say that all of the Terminids are actually blind. They have no eyes at all. They do, however, have a plethora of specialized sensory organs somewhere in there, and thus they can smell and hear anyone who may approach them. This makes the feats of the Pouncer and the Hunter caste overall just that much more impressive. Overall, the Scavenger tier generally gets overshadowed by the rest of the Terminid roster. However, they form the base that goes on to model the rest of the Terminids that will be seen in this whole video. With that being said, the next tier of Terminids is the Warrior tier. I have personally categorized 3 Terminids into the Warrior tier. Now, this might be controversial, but the first Terminid to be put into my Warrior tier is the Warrior. Upon first viewing it, it has a lot more of a uniform body structure than the Scavengers. Warriors are much larger and have a sturdy structure which allows them to be a, well, semi-deadly threat. It takes a lot less of them to overwhelm you than the Scavengers, but they still die fairly easily. One important subject of note, though, is the Warrior's nervous system. Never thought I'd say that. See, when you hit a headshot, well, it doesn't die. I don't know if I have footage of this, but essentially, the Warrior shows signs of a decentralized nervous system. What does this mean? Well, let's look at humans. They have a centralized nervous system, meaning the brain is basically connected to every other part of the body and controls them from up there. A decentralized nervous system, on the other hand, is like the whole brain being stretched out throughout the entire body. There can still be a centralized location which shows more activity than usual, but of course, if this area is eliminated, the body still goes on. Granted, this explanation was very basic, so if you want to learn more, please go research this because it's actually quite the interesting topic. Now, let's look at the details of the Warrior. If we direct our attention to its pincers, we see that the same doubled up pincers that were there on the Scavenger are now there on the Warrior as well, and it has the same 2 spikes around its mouth too. While again this seems insignificant, it's details like these that show us how the different forms of bugs go from one to another. If we really analyze the Warrior, we see that it actually looks just like the Scavenger, just a bit more elongated around its extremities. If we overlay the 2 of them, we see that the central body of the Warrior is almost identical to the full body of the Scavenger. Now, the Warrior is a prime example of what we would call the Terminid's first line of offense. Essentially, we'll see many different Terminids who are designed around either offense or mobility. Each Terminid will have a particular trait designed for these respective purposes. And the next Terminid that I have placed into the Warrior tier makes a great example of a Terminid which has taken on primarily defensive traits, and that is the Bile Spewer? Yes, I have put the Bile Spewer here, and I know what you're thinking. Zero, why would you put the Bile Spewer in the Warrior tier if he's not a warrior? And to that my response is, technically he is considered the direct evolution of the Bile Spitter. Now you may be saying, but Zero, what about the Bile Warrior? I mean, that seems like a much more obvious choice, and to that my response is, I'll get to that in a moment. So why did I put the Bile Spewer in this category? Well, it fits my criteria for what I put in this tier. It's basically just because it fits into this category as a direct evolution from the previous one better than the Bile Warrior does. See, the base Warrior is the most direct evolution of the base Scavenger that we can observe, and by extension, the Bile Spewer is as close as we can get to the Bile Spitter. This is made most evident by the size of its pincers. They are noticeably as small or of a similar size to the ones on the Bile Spitter. The Bile Spewers are technically the quote-unquote warriors of the Bile caste. That was quite the long-winded explanation, but I care about these details and believe that they are important and fun to discuss. Now, the bile spewer is a medium-sized terminid which also spews bile. However, it vomits it up in a far more consistent stream and actually does a significant amount of damage. Even with heavy armor, it can be quite devastating. Additionally, they have extra long-range capability by raising their abdomen and using a small gap at its tail end to fire concentrated bile at its target in a manner which is similar to a mortar. This, once again, looks similar to the use of formic acid in ant species from Earth, which also raise their abdomens in certain cases. We notice that the bile spewer's pincers remain, but they are in a small, vestigial state. This is most obviously because the spewer has no need for them. However, on extremely rare occasions, they can be to an extent used. It's just that with all the warriors, hunters, scavengers, and all the other bug kin surrounding them, they generally never have to resort to such an attack. In contrast, the rest of the bile spewer's legs are very enlarged so as to help with carrying the bile within their abdomen. Something interesting about this abdomen, however, is that for some odd reason it has armor on its top, but not the sides. Why is this? While at first glance you may assume that at some point the Terminids evolved to face an aerial threat, I believe this is not the case. Remember that many of the bile Terminids were created for the purpose of farming E710. I think that the spewer's abdomen being exposed on the sides, alongside the hole that it fires mortar shots from, show that this bug is specialized, designed even, for easy access to its abdomen, which is essentially one big barrel of space oil. In fact, the spewer is so filled to the brim with this bile that it can even be seen deforming parts of its skin around its head, particularly its neck, which hangs down under the weight of the bile spewer's burden. A final note on the bile spewer is that it has the same spikes around its mouth that its predecessor has, and another set which has developed above those. Also, we see that its teeth are eroded from constant friction with the bile that it spits, which is, again, a nice detail. The next entry into the warrior tier is one from the hunter caste. It's the hunter itself. I named the hunter caste after itself because all of the organisms following it in the hunter caste will all share a resemblance with it. Some of these key features are the wings, currently designed for propelling long-distance jumps, the square-shaped mouth, which kind of looks like a bit like the predator's mouth, which I'll actually touch on later, and notably, the same sickle-shaped pincers that the pouncer had, with much more spikes. We already discussed the purpose of the sickles and wings, however, the wide mouth is an interesting adaptation, which I believe is for the purpose of making space for these holes here. I assume these are where the hunter's tongues stick out, which is something that they don't do often, generally only comboing it with their pounce. The hunter keeps the same kind of spikes around the mouth that the rest of the Terminids thus far have had. However, they look far straighter. This is likely due to its pouncing nature. These spikes likely puncture the target following the use of its pincers and a pounce. As a result of its quick nature, the hunter is far thinner in comparison to something like the warrior, and while this is the case, the hunter may have the greatest capacity of brain matter. That is to say, the hunter will attempt to do things like flank the enemy or sneak up on it, or even react to the laser sights of Helldiver weaponry. This is quite interesting as it's one of the first signs we get of major intelligence, if not, dare I say, sentience. Whether or not they have sapience, though, is still up for debate. Overall, the organisms of the warrior tier are but the first in a long line of evolutions, which we get to see continued further in the next tier, which I have dubbed the medium tier. So the first entry into the medium tier is actually the commander subsection of Terminids. This consists of two organisms which are essentially identical. For one, the brood commander is identical to the base warrior in all but size and color. It adopts a darker reddish color, which is likely the result of the activation of some chemical that indicates its higher status, interacting with the already present chemical composition of its insides. This higher status allows it to summon warriors to its aid. This is only a juvenile form, however, of the most common commander, the Alpha Commander. Again, the Alpha Commander is nearly the same as the juvenile Brood Commander, but slightly larger. However, it does have many additional details and behaviors that set it apart a little bit. For one, it's super spiky, like across its whole body, which makes sense. If the warriors are the first line of offensive, then these guys are the special offensive forces. because they are much faster in both movement and attack speed. And the more prominent spikes across their body likely allow them to still get damage even if they miss an attack within their sporadic barrage, although this isn't translated as a feature into the game. They require a lot more damage to be killed. This damage also needs to be dealt quickly. If not, then it will enter the berserk state I mentioned earlier. But this one is different from the rest. It's restless and is probably the result of like 50% of all my deaths on the Terminid front. This unit can also summon a specialized form of the standard warrior, which is basically just the brood commander but smaller and without any summoning capabilities. It is, however, much faster than the standard warrior, allowing it to keep up pace with even lightly geared Helldivers in some cases. Interestingly, the Alpha Commander is not quick to initiate a fight. When at range, if a Helldiver does not engage, it will retreat for a moment, as if it's showing hesitation before moving in for the kill. This is a pointer, again, towards a greater intelligence in certain Terminid units, and to a certain extent, the Terminids as a whole. Now, the next unit in the medium tier is the Shrieker, as it appears to be the next step up in Hunter evolution. The first thing you might notice about the Shrieker are its arms. Nah, I'm just kidding. Obviously, this unit is derived from the Hunter, and it has wings which have massively enlarged, allowing for flight. It does, however, keep the standard details we've seen in the Hunter thus far. What's primarily interesting about these guys, though, is their behavior. See, the Shrieker has a specialized nest structure which will consistently produce shriekers until destroyed. These mushroom-like structures seem to have several little eggs on their undersides, which presumably constantly hatch shriekers. This structure shares a distinct resemblance with another structure called the spore spewer, which is one that distributes the spores that I spoke of earlier. The shrieker nest could be derived from the spore spewer, but it is unclear. Overall, the Shrieker has a darker color of armor, which is likely due to its origination as a mutation, and its behavior is generally basic, where it simply circles around the player and dives every once in a while to slash at them. Now, our next and final unit, which I have classified under the medium tier, is the Hive Guard. This unit is very similar to the Warrior in its general body structure, with the only major difference in that regard being its torso being a bit thicker than the average Warrior's, which may be a hint towards its eventual development into a Charger. Its armor, on the other hand, is quite different, being far thicker and requiring a level up in ordnance to destroy. Its armor, on the other hand, is quite different, being far thicker and requiring a level up in ordnance to destroy. What's interesting is the color of this armor, which is the same color as the armor that can be seen on bile spewers. This is no coincidence, as the same adaptation to keep your insides from getting out can also be applied when trying to keep your outsides from going in. It's a great detail on the part of the designers and shows just how cohesive they have been with their character design. Now, this armor is shaped in a particular fashion that allows the Hive Guard to essentially create a wall with its own body. This is a semi-common trope that we see among earth insects and arachnids called phragmosis, which is when an organism uses a specialized part of its body as a barrier of entry or defense to its burrow. The first organism, or more accurately image, that may come to mind when you think of this trait is the turtle ant. If you've had any interest in entomology, or really just the biology of any small invertebrates in the past couple of years, which I definitely have, see these channels, then you've probably seen this image, an image of a turtle ant's oddly shaped head. They use this trait as a kind of door that blocks the way into their hive. Similarly, I believe that the Hive Guard is adapted to this precise purpose, although it's definitely on a much different scale. It's likely that they would form a line that acts as a large wall spanning across the perimeter of said hive, although we can't say for sure, as the only times we really interact with them is when they are in active combat, in which the tactics they employ are defensive in nature but primarily offensive. When in an altercation with a Helldiver, they will first immediately approach them. Then, if the Helldiver attempts to run past them, they will either attack or strafe sideways in an attempt to block the Helldiver, possibly giving other units the opportunity for an attack. Now, if said Helldiver instead decides to fire upon it with a weapon that does not have appropriate armor penetration, it will enter the stance of the wall defense that I mentioned earlier in an attempt to defend itself. The next tier, which I have come up with myself, is the heavy tier. This tier is categorized, as you might expect, with entries from the 3 castes that are excessive in size or armor, with only one exception being the Stalker. Our first enemy into the heavy tier is the direct evolution of the Hive Guard from the medium tier. This organism is the Charger, but before we fully move on to the heavy tier, to elaborate on how the Hive Guard may transition to this unit, I've scored a collaboration with fellow YouTuber Sladen, popularly known for his work on the theoretical 4th Helldivers faction, War Dogs. He's here to give his take on how a transition between the Hive Guard and the Charger would look. So, without further delay...
Hello everyone, I drew up this concept once I heard that Below Zero was working on a video on the designs for the bugs in Helldivers 2. I'm very surprised no one else has made a video similar to this, which is that's crazy to me. So let's have a look at this little guy I came up with. For the time being, we're going to call this guy a Hive Sergeant, as it is a higher position than a guard. For the design, I wanted to make sure that the Hive Guard would develop the survival traits the Charger has in a very natural way. No longer just being used as a blockade on the battlefield, this guy has started to develop armor on its back limbs and sturdier, thicker armor on its forelimbs. Its head crest has started to curve out forward to better deflect debris. I came up with the idea that during the transitional phase, the skin starts to flake off, being replaced with thicker, sturdier armor to better protect its squishy insides. But during this phase, it leaves the sides and rear exposed to the elements, unintentionally making these obvious weak spots. I wanted to include these orange spines. I don't really know what they are, but they look cool and it's a great way to add color to the design. I am so glad I got the opportunity to be a part of this video. I love the Helldiver designs for their enemies. They're so sick. They're really good. I could talk about them forever. And the concept of the bugs evolving into one another is really cool. And I would love to see someone's take on the in-between stage of a Bile Warrior and a Bile Titan. There's a big gap between these two, so there's a lot of room to play with for a really cool concept. I'd love to see someone's art for it. If any of you guys want to see your own little creepy crawlies drawn up, just commission me on my coffee, as my commissions are up. That's all I have to say on the topic, and I hope you all have a good day spreading the good word of democracy.
And that we will, Sladen. Thank you so much for your valuable insight and the design that you made for this video. I'm truly grateful that you chose to showcase the lesser seen aspects of biology in fictional mediums, which is, of course, the creation of an organism itself, and considering gameplay aspects when designing them. And as he said, he's a super great artist, draws all kinds of stuff, and you can support him on Ko-Fi with an art commission. Thank you again, Sladen, for the collaboration, and with that being said, the Charger is our first big Terminid, eclipsing the size of the Bile Spewer by about a quarter or double. Its armor is significantly thicker than any bug on this entire analysis thus far. Once again, this armor is colored the same as the armor on Bile units, suggesting the same biocomposition being utilized for alternative purposes. In the case of the Charger, as its name suggests, it will rapidly charge at the Helldivers when it manages to recognize one. Its legs have not necessarily gained anything akin to muscle mass, but in reality, its new shell has been described as a meter, or 3 feet, thick across the most heavily armored parts of its body. So just imagine something as tough as a small vehicle running at you. Maybe not as fast as the vehicle itself, but definitely with more physicality and perceived intent. The Charger's face, if you could even call it that anymore, has the same set of spikes around the mouth. However, it's been doubled up for what I can only presume to be maximum killing efficiency. Notably, this is a development that we would begin to see in the Hive Guard and even a bit in the original Warrior. The Charger also sports a far evolved version of the pincers seen on these previous forms. They have a much more crab-like appearance, which means yet another species has fallen victim to carcinization. I'm just kidding. No. But it is interesting that Terminids have evolved the same kind of pincers that crabs have. On Earth, these would generally be used to pick up prey or really just grasp anything, but in the Charger's case, they are likely to be used in extremely niche situations, if not then completely vestigial. Additionally, the tip of the charger's head sports 3 sharp spikes. These were most obviously developed to significantly damage their prey. However, they play a pivotal role in the explanation behind one of the later organisms. As for the charger's behavior, when naturally patrolling or lingering in an area, the charger will often be completely still or move at a slow pace, only reacting to sound or significantly close proximity. It makes sense that the charger would not be as easily provoked as the rest of the bugs. It probably serves to conserve the charger's energy, and the armor likely suppresses a lot of its sensory organs. Once it is provoked, it will turn toward the source of the provocation and, well, charge. This charge can be devastating, being able to easily break multiple bones at once, and if the charger misses, it can also crush Helldivers with its front legs. But why do chargers charge in the first place? Well, we know that Terminid zoos exist to an extent through the form of Tyranny Park and Tyranny Park 2. We also know that genetically engineering Terminids is something that Super Earth does often. I wouldn't be surprised if the chargers were bred and conditioned in a way that is similar to bullfighting or bull chasing or whatever. It's kind of a far-off theory, but it is possible, especially considering that the Tyranny Park 2 MO had a lot to do with chargers, although I wasn't there myself, so I don't know the specifics. Overall, the Charger is an absolute unit of the Terminid, being what is essentially the final form of the Terminid warrior caste. However, the Charger has 2 offshoots which are specialized for a dichotomy of offense and defense, with the first, offense, being the Behemoth. This will be a short section because it's not all that different, but the Behemoth is a minor evolution of the Charger, which is made larger by significant extensions to its body armor, which are a lighter brown and kind of grayish in coloration. These extensions are very visibly designed for offensive purposes. This is most notable on its face, where the several spikes that were previously present have been reorganized into 3 large spikes, which likely allows for more effective impaling. Additionally, 3 large plates have been added to each leg of the Behemoth, which may allow for the Behemoths to charge more effectively and inflict fatal wounds through bone breakage on a Helldiver. Otherwise, the only real difference about this guy in comparison to the Charger is its teeth, 4 of which have gotten significantly larger for, well, obvious reasons. So, the Impaler is definitely the more interesting Charger variant of the 2, with the thickest armor of all the Terminids currently present on the battlefield, with the exception of, that one guy. Now, the majority of the Impaler is all but standard. His main body is really just a bigger version of the Charger's body. However, the most interesting part of the Impaler is, of course, its head, which has somehow been split into 3 long, extendable appendages. At the end of each one is a hardened spike, made from the same material that the rest of its armor is made from. That's not all. Not only does it have tentacles, but it has tentacles that can burrow underground independently from each other and pop up out of the ground in varied locations. Now, as far as I know, we don't really have any real-world parallels to this. There are insects with tentacles, but obviously, as far as I know, there are no insects or animals that can bury appendages into the ground and extend them long enough for them to come out on the other end. The Impaler's appendages in particular seem to be specialized for this purpose. They have a bunch of ridges on them, which allows this appendage to more easily plunge into the terrain of various planets. As for why they may have adapted such a trait, well, it's easy. This would be an extremely advantageous adaptation, essentially allowing a unit to defend its colony from the inside. And while we never actually see it doing that, I don't doubt that it's widely used among Terminid colonies for that purpose. While these tentacles are the most prominent part of the Impaler, they are not, to me personally, the most interesting part, as when they're dug into the ground, we see this array of 27 eyes, or otherwise sensory organs. This is the first recorded instance of true sight in a Terminid. These, albeit primitive eyes, were likely evolved in conjunction with the Impaler's signature ability. Considering that there are no sensory organs at the end of each appendage, these probably allow the bug to know where to attack with its tentacles when they are plunged into the ground. And to confirm that these are eyes and not sensory organs, if we look closely enough at the model, we can just barely make out a pupil. As a final note on the Impaler, I'd just like to mention that while most people can't see this, the Impaler's mouth is actually visible from under its tentacles, and it does follow the structure of previous Terminid mouths that we've observed the structure of, which is a nice touch from the developers, as they could have added anything there and no one would really have noticed or cared, except for me, of course. And that concludes the Chargers, and by extension, the rest of the Warrior cast, but there remains 2 more casts to be concluded, the next being the Hunter cast, which is concluded with the Stalker. The Stalker is the largest hunter form that we've seen thus far. Its appendages have grown long and skinny, and upon its shell is a plethora of black markings. These markings would, to a degree, help the Stalker be more concealed in dark environments. Although these markings are minimal because, of course, the Stalkers have the unique ability to camouflage themselves to match their environments. This ability is said to be the result of Terminid gene splicing research, although I presume that if this kind of bug were to evolve without this unique ability, it would have come to have an entirely black shell. The dark of these markings can most prominently be seen on its head, which also features wing-like structures, and most notably, a mouth with 4 corners which has a spike protruding from each of them. This mouth can also expand extremely wide. Interestingly, I feel that this mouth structure is an allusion to the mouth structure of the Predator. It's still quite different, but the similarities are definitely there. Now, within its mouth, it has a tongue, just as the Hunter had, but much longer and far more powerful. It can knock a stable Helldiver off its feet with ease, and that's just its tongue. Its main form of offense are its arms, which have gone from sickle-like claws to full-fledged raptorial forelegs. These are very similar to those seen on a praying mantis. It, of course, uses these appendages to slash at any Helldivers who it's decided to hunt. See, the Stalker has a unique way of engaging in offensive altercations. It appears to showcase the most sophisticated thinking thus far, as it will almost always try to flank Helldivers, and if they get close enough, they'll either use their tongues or claws to strike. If the Helldiver dies, they'll move on, but if the Helldiver lives and deals them enough damage, the Stalker will actually retreat and try again after healing. But that's not the extent of their thinking capacity. In certain cases, Stalkers will attempt to lure Helldivers away from their squad by backing away from them as the Helldiver gives chase. It doesn't always work, as Helldivers are generally equipped with explosive weapons like the Eruptor and just blow them up from afar, but it still remains a completely unique ability to themselves and shows that they take their spot as one of the smartest Terminids on the battlefield. Now, the final unit on the heavy tier is the one you've probably been anticipating this whole time, and if you've made it this far without skipping ahead, I commend you, for now, we finally analyze the most iconic of the Terminids, the Bile Titan. This hulking beast of a bug is one of the most dangerous Terminids that a Helldiver could possibly encounter. It truly has come a long way since its humble beginnings as a mere bile spitter, but we still see some factors that identify them with each other. Most prominently, we see the color of its shell, but a more detailed look shows that it has kept the same doubled up spikes that were able to be seen near the mouths of its predecessors, with the pincers also being this way, still divided into 2 parts, although they have been largely elongated. What is definitely different from the Bile Titan compared to those predecessors is their massive impaling legs. See, if you happen to get too close to this beast, you'll be sure to be impaled by its legs turned massive spears, but don't think running from it will save you, as it retains the ranged capabilities of its predecessor. But of course, in classic Terminid fashion, the spew of bile is bigger and far more dangerous. It can, however, be easily dealt with by destroying its bile sacs, thus forcing it to only use melee. Now, why would such a huge bug ever need to be evolved in the colony? Well, the answer is, as is usual for this cast, space oil. I presume that the bigger the bug, the bigger the production of space oil for Super Earth to farm up and turn into fuel for their super destroyers. Were the Bile Titans to have developed independently, however, I would presume that it would have appeared out of a need for colonies to have defense against threats from high altitude areas. Similarly to the Impaler, the Bile Titan's practical use likely boils down to a defense of a hive or outpost with an exposed roof from behind a wall, in a way using its spew of bile as a kind of turret. This purpose is made more evident by the fact that it has now developed twice the bile sacs as the bile spewer. Now, if I may suggest a wild theory, my guess would be that this abomination was the result of Super Earth trying to combine 2 bile spewers into one organism, assuming that it would produce twice the E710. I know, it's frankly stupid, but let's not forget that they used ants as a gauge for whether or not Terminids had hive intelligence. Propaganda or not, that is not the most smart move. A final note for the Bile Titan is that while not exactly canon, I don't know for sure, the Bile Titan can sometimes twitch upon death. This has resulted in, well, unsavory moments for our dear Helldivers. I would, of course, attribute these to a decentralized nervous system, although, of course, to a much lesser extent than something like the Alpha Commander. Although a variant of the Bile Titan that runs at you before dying if you headshot it with something like a recoilless rifle would be awesome. Arrowhead, please add that, please. You might have noticed that there were a few Terminids which I didn't cover, namely the Nursing Spewer, the Bile Warrior, and the Spore Charger. I won't talk about these guys at length because I couldn't find a place for them in the pacing of this video, but essentially, I think they're all the result of Super Earth intervention or some kind of accident within the Terminid ranks, possibly influenced by the TCS. See, I believe that the caste a Terminid becomes a part of is determined by a certain chemical or pheromone it's exposed to at birth. I believe that the Bile Warrior and Spore Charger are the result of a Terminid being exposed to multiple of these at once, thus resulting in a hybrid. And as for the Nursing Spewer, I believe, as its name suggests, it's a simple adaptation of the standard Bile Spewer to nurse scavengers more effectively to adulthood. I believe that was specifically brought on by a mutation from the TCS. The first thing we notice upon viewing the sporeburst scavenger and the sporeburst terminids as a whole is that they are much paler than their standard orange and green cousins. Based on the fact that these terminids are known to be a mutation of the standard units, I believe this to be a case of leucism, which is a condition found in a variety of animals that creates a similar white pigment. This condition itself is caused by a mutation which reduces melanin but doesn't completely eliminate it as it would be with albinism. I wouldn't be surprised if this was a byproduct of the grander sporeburst mutation as a whole. The sporeburst scavenger has a variety of growths that seem to be uncontrolled, which is again likely the result of a mutation which alters the way that the sporeburst terminids grow that is itself a symptom of the overall sporeburst mutation. I'm going to talk about these growths later, so just keep those in mind. These are but side effects of the mutation's true purpose though, which is of course to cause the terminids to explode into a harmful cloud of spores upon death. But what does this mutation really change? See, I don't believe that the terminids subject to this mutation simply suddenly gain the ability to explode into a bunch of spores. Rather, we should consider that because this mutation is a direct result of the gloom, the mutation likely alters the internal biology of the terminids themselves, so as to make the insides of their bodies a habitable location for gloom spores to be generated from said terminid's birth. This may then play into how natural selection may have allowed these terminids to, well, not immediately go extinct as a throwaway mutation. Now, I'm not saying that the gloom kills or harms the terminids, but rather I'm saying that the terminids with this adaptation were more effective at surviving gloom-infected environments. Additionally, assuming that terminids have internal conflicts of leadership, which would make sense considering they have units like the Alpha Warrior, the Brood Commander, the Alpha Commander, and even the Hive Lord. The crest of pale red growths coming from the top of their head and forward appendages could function as notations of status, with them being above the rest of the terminids, even if they don't have command over them like the other units. Also, we should consider that these strains of terminids have not existed for very long, so the effect that natural selection could have even had on them in the first place is very limited. Moving on to the Sporeburst Warrior, it's really just the grown version of the Sporeburst Scavenger. Reflecting on this, I'd have to say that the Sporeburst Terminids, while still naturally deadly, are the weakest of all the Terminid strains when it comes to the individual basis. They're essentially just reskins of their standard variants, with the only real difference being what happens upon their death. The real danger of these Terminids comes in numbers. When they show up to a fight, they show up to a fight. See, I think that in-game, rather than the Sporeburst Terminids replacing their standard variants on a planet, they stack on top of the spawn rates of their standard variants. This leads to a massive swarm that, when combined with the constantly damaging clouds of spores upon their death, creates a lethal swarm that naturally boxes you in when you're cornered. This also applies to the sporeburst hunter, however, it is of course much faster and deadlier. That doesn't stop them from spawning in mass quantities though. In fact, sometimes I feel like I see them more than I do the warriors, but that might just be because they get to me first due to their enhanced speed. While the sporeburst hunter is, again, essentially a reskin, I find it interesting to question their existence in the game's lore. See, in the base Terminids, the pouncer evolves into the hunter. That much is obvious. However, no sporeburst pouncer can be seen. This was pointed out by this commenter who left an amazing response to my long Terminids video, where he pointed out that on this chart that I made for the video, I organized the sporeburst category like this, which at first seems to make sense, but when considering that the sporeburst Terminids are the result of a mutation and not evolution, they would have to be organized in the same way that the standard Terminids are, just modified. That is to say, sporeburst scavenger becomes sporeburst warrior, but that leaves a gap where a sporeburst pouncer would be. The best explanations for this gap would be that there's a sporeburst pouncer and we just never see them, or that the evolution from a sporeburst pouncer to a sporeburst hunter accelerated due to the mutation, so much so that we never see the sporeburst pouncers because of how fast they become hunters. Overall, the sporeburst strain, while kind of weak, are still some of the most intimidating and interesting Terminids that we've seen thus far. Our next strain, influenced by the gloom, however, possesses no such weaknesses, and that is the predator strain. The Predator strain is said to be a strain of Terminids that are gloom enhanced. I presume that this means that they are not direct results of the gloom, but rather empowered by the gloom and directly the result of something else. See, I have this theory, and at the moment it has no direct evidence. However, I would still like to put it out there as others have before. I believe that there is some kind of greater intelligence controlling the Terminids. Similar to how the Flood has a grave mind, I think the Terminids are being controlled by some mother of all Terminids hive brain thing that's in part influencing how the Terminids evolve. See, the Predator strain's primary ability is essentially active camo, and because of this, the Predator strain simply could not be the result of the Terminids adapting to the gloom environments, as if it were the case, the Sporeburst Terminids would have to have some kind of active camo there too. Rather, I believe that the gloom empowered whatever it is behind the Terminid forces to be able to create this specialized force of Terminids that it can deploy as it sees fit. It's definitely outlandish, and there are probably some other explanations. If you have any, I encourage you to leave these in the comments below. Thinking about it now, there's really not much special about the Predator strain other than the camo and their origins. They're kind of just versions of the Hunter and Stalker that are blue, green, yellow, and red with some speed and strength buffs. Apparently, Predator Hunters can spit some bile, but I've never seen them do this, so I presume it's either very rare or I'm very lucky. Overall, I just hope to see the Predator and Sporeburst strains get expanded on in the future. I'd love to see something like a Sporeburst Charger, which has squishy armor, but when killed explodes with the force of a small bomb. Please add that arrowhead, it would be awesome. Let's go over what we know about the Rupture Terminids. They are said to have lost the chitin layer that insulated them from solar radiation due to a gloom-induced mutation, which has caused them to prefer burrowing. Funnily enough, the definitely not biased Super Earth Xeno-entomologists say that this is a result of the Rupture Terminids being exposed to the light of liberty. It seems like this mutation is what ultimately led to the existence of the rampant caves in the hive worlds, as it would be mutually beneficial for multiple Terminids with this mutation to congregate underground. Additionally, it would also be beneficial for these Terminids to cultivate hive lungs, as the more clouded and convoluted any given hive world's atmosphere is, the less solar radiation can kill Terminids. So basically, the new Terminids in the Into the Unjust update exist because of cancer. The first Terminid among the ranks of the Rupture strain is the Rupture Warrior. One of the first things I notice about it, aside from the dome, are the claws. They are significantly larger than the claws on the original Warrior, most obviously for better digging. The same goes for the dome, which appears to have unique ridges that likely allow for the displacement of subterranean materials when tunneling. The reddish-gray coloration seems to be the result of the radiation, although it could also be some kind of camouflage or chemical reaction with the environment of the hive worlds. The Rupture Warrior's main functionality is, of course, burrowing. These warriors will naturally burrow into the ground and will either approach Helldivers while burrowing and attack them, or naturally remain underground and pursue Helldivers when they get close. Its functionality outside of combat is likely to develop Terminid caves on hive worlds. I would assume that these biological structures that we can see in the caves are the result of the Rupture Warriors doing something similar to many Earth wasps, mixing the surrounding organic materials with their own spit so as to create structures. The purpose of these structures, however, is a mystery to me, although they may just be natural byproducts of the cave-making process. Overall, this is a pretty standard Terminid, with only a few basic modifications to complete a certain task as optimally as possible. I find that this is in some way realistic. It's not an over-the-top mutation or anything, it's just a warrior well adapted for an alternative niche. And similar can be said for our next unit in the Rupture strain, the Rupture Charger. The Rupture Charger is essentially a generic charger, with the only physical aspects changed being, of course, the dome-like head with the specialized ridges, and front legs which have similar structures. Behavior-wise, the Rupture Charger will act similarly to the Warrior, chasing Helldivers from underground and jumping out at them when close enough. As for where the Charger stands from a utility standpoint, of course, I would call these guys the heavy lifters when it comes to the construction of Terminid caves, likely serving to push large rocks out of the way, or create large tunnels for other Rupture Terminids to work and house in. Now, one might assume that the Rupture Warrior is what fills in the more general excavating purposes, however, I believe this role actually applies to our next and final Rupture strain Terminid is the Rupture Spewer. Now, I saved this Rupture Terminid for the last of the group because I believe it is the most interesting. For one, it has some interesting differences to the natural Bile Spewer. Its head has the same dome and ridges of the rest of the Rupture strain, and it has an armor plate on the bottom of its bile sac to more smoothly traverse below the ground. Additionally, this specialized bile spewer seems to have a more potent spew of bile, which, according to, again, unbiased super-Earth xenoentomologists, comes from them eating their own dead. Of course, this is likely to be untrue, but it's possible. Now, as for what I find most interesting about this unit, it has been long since speculated that the bile caste of Terminids utilizes its bile secondarily to dig burrows and outposts. This unit all but confirms that. If this were a Terminid-wide mutation, we would be seeing Rupture Hunters or Stalkers, but the two specialized Terminids that would be the most optimal for excavations are the ones who have been afflicted by the mutation. It can be assumed that the Rupture Spewer is likely to be the backbone of what allows the caves on the hive worlds to exist. While Chargers may be the excavators and Warriors the bricklayers, the Rupture Spewers must be what dissolves and softens all of the subterranean materials blocking the way. And that just about wraps up the Rupture strain. However, there are some more Terminids to cover, the first of those being the Dragon Roach. The Dragon Roach is one of the newest Terminid entries that appear to be a fusion of two different castes, the Hunter and Bile castes, which you can hear more about in my dedicated Terminids video. This monstrosity of a Terminid is likely to be the result of a mutation that caused the DNA of a Shrieker and a Bile Titan to be fused before birth. We can even see its mutated properties in its very appearance. For one, its body is far oversized in comparison to its limbs, showing that such a large and small Terminid have been fused. Additionally, the Dragon Roach's front limbs are sickle-shaped, which, if you watched my dedicated Terminid video, you'd know is a textbook indicator of the Hunter caste, and seen on the Shrieker itself. And just to note the dev's attention to detail, we see on its face that it has the same mouth structure as seen on the Bile caste, but the same mandibles as those seen on the Hunter caste. It has the same spikes that can be seen on the Shrieker's back, but the same plating as the Bile Titan's back. And while it has the same mouth structure as the Bile Titan, it has the same upper teeth of the Shrieker. I find it genuinely baffling that the devs put so much care into making it clear that this was a fusion of the two, but that's not the only thing interesting about the Roach. See, the spew of bile that the Bile Titan naturally spews has somehow become fire in this bug. There are probably a lot of theories around this, however, I would claim that this is the same spew of bile but diluted. See, I would assume that the natural bile titan generates a very large amount of heat when spewing its bile. However, this heat may never become fire due to the liquid aspect of the bile quenching the fire before it can even occur. In the case of the dragon roach, however, I believe that the bile has now become diluted, allowing it to generate far more heat than any other bile unit has been able to produce thus far. And of course, this unit won't burn itself because of its high velocity in the open air, putting out any fires that may occur on its body if they even do occur at all. The Hive Lord is the largest Terminid organism to date, coming in at an estimate of a whopping 500 feet tall. This Terminid is so massive, its primary form of offense is its own body. The worm will forcibly collapse onto any Helldiver who dares to approach its territory. But that's not all. If it cannot get within body slam range, it'll spew massive amounts of bile in what I assume to be about a 300 to 200 foot radius ahead of it. This thing doesn't really fit into any of the casts. It doesn't seem to be any kind of evolution, nor does it show any of the textbook features of each cast. My best guess, however, would be the bile cast, as a bile sac can be seen at the tail end of its body, but otherwise, I would actually presume that this is more likely to be a direct evolution of the original Hive Lord from Helldivers 1. We can see that through evolution, its mouth expanded in a way, where the part with all the teeth is now open and the mandibles have been pushed backwards. This likely occurred so as to allow for the large-scale spitting of bile, something which it could do in the previous games, but at very limited capacity. It also seems to have massively grown in size since then, which is likely also a factor in its increased effectiveness at spewing bile. Now, in Helldivers 1, the Hive Lord was said to be the unit that dug out tunnels for the Terminids, and it's no different here. If the Rupture Strain Terminids are the ones who flesh out and expand each cave, the Hive Lord is the one who gives them the blank canvas to do so in the first place. While the bile is definitely effective in combat, I believe its real purpose is to be even more effective at digging. In the previous game, the Hive Lords were said to have the potential to perforate entire planets. These buffed up ones, however, have already accomplished this in the form of the Hive Worlds. Due to their massively increased size, I would presume that by now, every planet with a sizable population of Hive Lords has had their entire crust cut up and perforated with just a bunch of tunnels. We will likely never experience combat with any single Terminid larger, more powerful, or more impactful than this one. At least, I hope we won't. Evolution is primarily influenced through the means of natural selection, which is defined as the phenomenon where organisms of a particular species that are adapted better to survive in their environment will typically survive more than organisms of that same species that aren't as well adapted, and eventually replace them as the next iteration of that species. The unneeded parts for survival are discarded in favor of superior traits. Now, of course, this exact scenario can't occur with artificial machines. However, in a way, machines can be subject to a kind of unnatural selection, where each previous iteration is discarded in favor of one that allows it to complete its task as effectively as possible. Take the iPhone, for example. The iPhone 1 doesn't look all that different from the iPhone 2, as it only really added 3G functionality, along with some other internal changes. However, if we skipped forward to the 5th iPhone, the overall structure has gotten more rigid than round. The camera lens has gotten slightly larger, and again, several internal changes were made. The unneeded parts for the creator's intentions were discarded in favor of superior traits. Except in this case, the creator is actually the cyborgs designing their own children. The automatons are essentially an all-mechanical race of what I guess you could call organisms that are primarily made of various metals, presumably a mix of things like titanium and tungsten for heavier bots and steel for the lighter ones. Please note that my knowledge of metals is limited and these may or may not be accurate judgments. How they are powered, however, is something interesting to consider, as there are a few different theories about it, most of which are supported by the existence of automaton bioprocessors. See, the automatons have become much more brutal than their predecessors, the cyborgs. Rather than taking super-Earth rebels and converting them into half-machine, half-human abominations, instead they just kidnap whatever humans, civilian or not, that happen to be on the planet that they invade and grind them up in a blender. What they do with this is what I'd like to consider. Now, it was confirmed by a hopefully reliable developer, I don't really know much about the developers of Helldivers or who does what or anything, that automatons don't have brains, as that would make them cyborgs. I would be willing to argue with that for ages, but that's not why I'm here. So, with the existence of bioprocessors, I personally believe that the cyborgs are actually powered by human blood, or more accurately, biomatter, which would explain the reddish color liquid that explodes out of the trooper units when shot, as well as the same colored tubes around their body. However, if that still crosses into the range of cyborg territory, I would suggest that they instead use plain old biofuel. We don't exactly have a real-world equivalent to whatever the automatons are using to convert human blood into biological fuel, but you could say that we get close with the way that we deconstruct plants and other biological materials before upgrading the parts that the deconstruction results in. Additionally, another theory for the bioprocessors is that they don't take brains and put them inside automatons, but instead, they harvest brains for the purpose of modeling computers after them. We should remember that the greatest computer of all time, at least in human history, is the human brain, as it has gone through what could be considered trillions of iterations, each hopefully better than the last due to natural selection. Now, aside from this power source, of course, a cornerstone of the automatons are their weapons, which, upon a first glance, look like laser weapons, but that's actually a misconception popularized by none other than Star Wars, which does have its own in-universe explanation for this. See, lasers are supposed to generate an extremely intense beam of light, which, of course, has to go at the speed of light. The lasers that the Helldivers have are a lot more accurate to this description. On the other hand, I don't think the automatons use true lasers, but rather they use plasma guns, which are essentially guns that primarily consist of a power source and a gas container. Pulling the trigger, or just issuing a signal to shoot the gun, will cause the power source to superheat the gas, converting it into the fourth state of matter, plasma. This plasma is then somehow propelled out of the gun at a speed that is perceptible to the human eye. This is made more evident by the fact that the automaton weaponry is often referred to with the prefix fusion, in the wiki at least. Assuming this is credible, which that is what I will be assuming since it doesn't really make that much of a difference, it seems like whatever this power source that superheats the gas is uses fusion energy, which is absurdly complicated, so if you want to know more about it, go read about it on Wikipedia or something, I don't know. On the topic of gunfire, most automatons are actually affected by suppressing fire. When shot at for extended periods of time, many automatons will lose accuracy. Just really lose accuracy. How can you be this bad at aiming? This points towards a capacity to feel fear, which then opens the gateway to the feeling of other emotions. This tells us that the automatons are a slight bit more human than we think. Finally, before we start analyzing, as I did in my last video, I've made a diagram that shows what I personally believe to be how the automaton units are connected to each other, and will be what I use for the remainder of this video. I've split them into 3 tiers, the light, medium, and heavy tier, the first of which that we'll be covering is, of course, the light tier. The first thing we notice upon observing the trooper is its distinct skull-shaped head, which is plated with bright metal on its front and darker metal on the sides. The eye sockets are filled out by 2 bright red visual sensors. This bright red color is possibly illuminated by the primary power source of this bot. The areas where the nose and mouth would be have teeth-like structures. It's hard to see in this ripped model, but the image shows it quite clearly. This may be a pointer to a need for consumption of food. That is unlikely though, and it's probably an intimidation technique. I also expect that the trooper's voice box is located behind those teeth. The back of its head seems to have some kind of vent illuminated by the power source, which is likely there for the purpose of avoiding overheat. Extending down from the head, we see a large variety of tubes, or wires, that go on to run across the entire body. Now, I don't really know much about robotics, but it seems like this is either a kind of hydraulics or just really thick wires. I find hydraulics to be the more likely option, as that flows nicely, no pun intended, into the theory of somehow using the biomatter from the bioprocessors as what powers them. Now, in modern day, hydraulics, as opposed to what the name suggests, don't really use water all that much. Instead, they use different kinds of custom synthesized hydraulic oils, which provide lubrication. Maybe the automatons have found a way to synthesize a usable hydraulic oil out of the biomatters that humans can be broken down into. Another possibility is that this is a form of pneumatics, which is the use of gases in mechanical systems. The automatons may have found a way to convert the biomatter into, again, a usable gas for pneumatic applications. Otherwise, they could just be really thick cables of electricity or something that's generated with a standard biofuel generator or something. I don't know. As we move down to the torso, we see a lot more metal plating and tubes, but most notably, on its back we see two metal structures with a kind of metal grating or grill, which on the surface serves as more armor plating, but in truth, gives the trooper a kind of modularity, as it seems like this allows accessories like ammo boxes, jetpacks, and flammable gas containers to simply be slid on. This is probably put in place for cost efficiency in terms of resources, and is probably what leads to the major weaknesses regarding these three attachments, which is, of course, their tendency to explode. This kind of modularity probably makes the assembly process in the fabricators much easier and shorter to produce as much cannon fodder as possible. Moving down to the legs, they seem to be connected to the torso by a kind of swivel, and use the same kind of joints. These legs would be classified as digitigrade, which in present-day robotics is useful for stability, speed, and, something not a lot of people talk much about, storage efficiency. See, some real-world robots with digitigrade legs can fold them back when deactivated, which may immediately bring up images of the folded B-1 battle droids from Star Wars in your mind. In a similar way, I believe that the automaton troopers are designed to be folded in this way for better transportation. Using the Ragdoll Mover add-on in Gary's mod, I've surmised that it would be folded in the way you see on screen here. Keep in mind that this is just my estimate though, based on my own idea of what would make sense. The trooper wields what is often referred to as a fusion rifle on the wiki, which fires in 5-round bursts before it needs to cool down. The appearance of this gun shows how it's a plasma weapon. We see it consists of 3 primary parts: the heat source, the gas canister, and the barrel. The heat source seems to be the same kind of power source that most automatons utilize, although rather than a vent, this weapon has what I believe to be a heat sink in order to cool down. There are tubes running to and from this power source to the midsection of the gun, which I believe to be a gas canister. Interestingly, the trigger is actually off to the right side rather than the back, which is an interesting way of compacting this gun. Now, I assume that with every trigger pull, the heat source will emit a mass amount of heat, hot enough to convert gas into plasma, and shoot that heat into the gas canister. Then, as plasma forms, I believe that a small hole or slit that leads into the barrel will open, and the momentum of the sudden blast of heat into the gas chamber will propel the plasma out of the barrel. The trooper's behavior in-game is pretty basic. It tries to keep its distance from the enemy. When said enemy gets too close, it punches, and when the enemy tries to hide, it throws grenades to flush the enemy out of cover. Overall, the trooper is a simply, yet thoughtfully designed automaton that truly does what anyone would ask of a robot. It gets the job done. As a result of its useful nature, the Trooper is a dynamic unit which can be adjusted in a bunch of ways. One such variation is the Brawler, which is essentially the same as the Trooper, but with 2 giant swords attached to both of its arms. These swords seem to be made of 2 blades of some kind of material or alloy connected to 2 power sources that heat these blades to what I can assume to be extremely high temperatures. I'm not entirely sure what this material is, but I can assume that it's made out of some kind of tungsten, or maybe just plain old steel, as both of those have melting points that are far into the range of the kind of thing that would sear human flesh. Something notable about the Brawler is, well, it's quite dumb. This unit doesn't have much in the way of intelligence, aside from the ability to man machine gun emplacements for some reason. At least that's what the wiki says, because, well, He doesn't seem like he would really have the ability to, operate any kind of a handheld machine, This lack of intelligence makes sense, as I would suppose that most automatons are programmed with preset functions rather than machine learning or neural networks. Well, yeah, they still probably have those. They seem to be able to show some emotion and, they still need to adapt to situations. We should still consider that they are assembled on open battlefields with portable fabricators. It would be far more efficient to have these guys come out with maybe millions of lines of code, if they even use code in the first place, that already allow it to know how to do things that it specifically needs to do, rather than programming that allows it to naturally learn how to do all those things over time, as cool as that idea sounds. In all likelihood, it's probably a combination of both. My primary theory is that when automaton troopers are fabricated, and when any automaton is fabricated, they are made with a pre-made set of code that tells it how to complete the tasks it was designed for, and also allows in part for it to learn and feel. With that tangent aside, this topic will come up later, so just keep in mind that the programming of each automaton is likely to be unique to its purpose. Another variant of the base trooper is the Rocket Raider. This is, again, a standard trooper, but with a big rocket launcher on top of its shoulder. Its behavior is standard, as expected. The only really interesting thing about it is the rocket itself, which seems to have a kind of user interface. One would assume that this is to lock onto the enemy, but of course, these rocket raiders don't exactly have the greatest accuracy. My best guess is that these work as a kind of iron sight or reflex sight or something, but it is unconfirmed, and, I would assume that the automaton's vision itself has a user interface built into it, but otherwise, the rocket launcher design is kind of standard. It has a shoulder pad for recoil control, a vertical foregrip for even more recoil control, and a seemingly standard loading mechanism. The next variant of the trooper is one that is far more interesting, as it's the first major point of evidence that one thinks of when asserting that the automatons have a kind of sapience. In other words, the ability to be wise and to understand complex situations beyond oneself. The existence of a commissar, or otherwise any other kind of military leader, potentially shows that automatons have traits such as the ability to learn and reason and become wiser on the battlefield. On the PlayStation page, they are stated to be a mere simulation of military leadership, with slightly faster processing power than their comrades. However, I believe that whatever code that these particular machines possess is far more advanced than whatever Super Earth propaganda tells us. One thing that I'm sure you know about the Commissar is their ability to rally the surrounding automaton units to chant with them in a marching cadence. I find that this, in some way, puts the Commissar into a position that, in a way, could be compared to present-day drill sergeants, or otherwise a unit that ranks above its peers and possibly helps train them, somehow. I guess in this case, the quote-unquote training would be future troopers being based on the code of experienced Commissars. More likely, though, since the automatons are still fabricated on the spot, it could be true that the Commissar unit could be extensively used in alternative situations, particularly within automaton command centers such as ships or bases. I would consider that, toward the more advanced automaton units, the Commissars would be able to remotely command them. While it's fragile, these units can even bring whole factory striders into their marching cadence, leading me to believe that their kind are the units that directly deploy automaton forces on their side of the galactic war, aside from the cyborgs, who I believe are still in control of everything. The weapon that the Commissar sports is, of course, the same kind of weapon as all the rest, a fusion firearm. However, this one is a pistol of a much smaller size. This means that the fusion power source and gas storage device must be smaller, and thus must result in a far less heated projectile that lasts for a shorter amount of time before dissipating back into gas. This isn't really that much reflected in gameplay though, likely due to how significant of a difference this would be in combat. Additionally, while never used, the pistol also seems to have two railings, likely used for laser attachments and flashlights, and some small trivia that I haven't seen discussed much, likely because it's quite obvious. The Commissar seems to be very directly inspired by the Commissar from Warhammer 40k, who has a bolt pistol that looks very similar to this one. Our next automaton is seemingly the direct step up from the base trooper. The Marauder is a trooper that has been upgraded in physicality through extra armor on the shoulders, back, and face. It seems to have been upgraded technologically in some way as well, with several more tubes running along the chest. There really isn't much special about the Marauder, as it really is just a more buffed up trooper. One thing I've noticed is that these automatons tend to be operating machine gun emplacements more often, but that might just be by chance. The Marauder on its own seems to be purposeless, but their real purpose seems to be assigned to a position that we know as the MG Raider. This is, again, a standard Marauder unit that has been equipped with a portable fusion machine gun and a power pack strapped to its back. The machine gun itself seems to be a direct modification to the rifle that's been given a much longer barrel. I assume this barrel is to allow for a slightly longer projectile travel time, as the plasma will immediately begin to dissipate as it leaves the barrel, but I really don't know how effective this would be. Now, the text on the back of the MG Raider's power pack, when translated from the automaton's own language, says everything for the collective. The power pack itself is designed for two purposes. For one, it's of course a power source, which allows the fusion machine gun to fire an additional 7 rounds from the rifle, making for a total of 12 rounds before needing to cool down. The MG Raider also seems to be the automaton's designated self-destructor, at least in the ranks of the troopers. At first, one may assume that the fuel rods sticking out like that are a mere design flaw. However, I propose that these are specifically placed near the head so that when an opposition attempts a headshot at close range, they mistakenly hit the fuel rod and initiate a self-destruction. Now, the troopers are, of course, not going to cut it when it comes to being the automaton's main infantry force. I would assume that they generally serve functional purposes, like operating heavy machinery or keeping structures like fabricators operational. While this is the case, they do still have a viable combative use, and that use is through the Scout Strider. This automaton unit is composed of 3 parts: the cockpit, the power source, and the legs. The cockpit is made of large, heavy armor plates. One of these plates has a small slit that the piloting trooper can look through. Alongside that, it also has a twin-barreled fusion machine gun. This weaponry presumably works the same way as all the rest of the fusion weapons, that is to say a gas chamber and a power source, both of which are likely to be located in the midsection, which, accordingly, is the second most vulnerable part of the Scout Strider, although weaker calibers still cannot penetrate it. The most vulnerable part of this vehicle is the legs, which, oddly enough, are largely unarmored. Again, I assume that this isn't a direct design flaw, but rather an intentional trade-off for additional speed. As its name suggests, the Scout Strider likely sees a wider use in reconnaissance rather than active combat. If we take a look at some of this machine's finer details, we see a control system on the inner part of the cockpit. The steering mechanism, assuming it can be rotated, is, as far as I've researched, a butterfly steering wheel. Essentially, it's been divided into 2 handles that can be rotated either left or right. This is an assumption, but I think the pilot would push or pull these handles omnidirectionally, which would cause this structure here, that I assume is flexible, to bend in the direction that the pilot chooses, which would then send a signal to the Scout Strider's legs. As for the legs themselves, they are powered using the same techniques seen on the troopers, with wires that can be seen near the joints that make up their digitigrade limbs. A variation of the Scout Strider that's likely designed for more intensive reconnaissance situations is, well, the reinforced Scout Strider. It's not all that different from the original Scout Strider, only having extra armor protecting the pilot within and a disposable 4-missile system that I presume must be loaded from an external source. What is primarily interesting about this unit is the fact that the pilot inside is essentially sealed within the cockpit, no method of entry or exit. Interestingly enough, it seems to be a slight call towards the inspiration that Helldivers takes from Warhammer 40k, in particular the Dreadnought. Now, when you see this thing, you obviously think about the Hulk. However, in 40k, a Dreadnought, to the extent of my knowledge of the extremely complex Warhammer lore, is a near-dead space marine, put inside of a box and sent to control a big box of metal, which, if you think about it, could be similar to what's happening here with the Scout Strider, a unit of a massive army which has been sealed inside a machine to more effectively engage in combat. Otherwise, it's only a mere upgrade to the Scout Strider. With that being said, we've reached the end of the light tier and the beginning of our next one, the medium tier, otherwise known as the Devastator tier because it's literally just Devastators. Our first unit of this tier is the Vanilla Devastator. This format dominates all of the medium tier as they are essentially the embodiment of medium infantry. If you have high ordnance, then they're dealt with easily, but units such as Super Earth's Armed Forces troopers don't have access to such ordnance that the Helldivers, essentially Super Earth's special forces, do. When using smaller arms, your best bet at killing these guys is with a clean headshot. The Devastators can retaliate though, using their integrated double-barrel fusion arm cannons. The choice to make them integrated shows that, unlike troopers, Devastators are likely not intended for any non-combative tasks, as missing an entire hand would be, quite unwieldy for such things as machine operation and construction. These fusion cannons are, again, likely to be plasma-based, in which case I believe that the power source would be here, and the gas chamber here. There are also two additional red attachments that I would assume are either auxiliary power sources or augments to make the weapon more powerful. The other arm is reserved for punching or other point-blank combative engagements. It has 2 fingers and an opposable thumb, as well as 2 blunt spikes above the hands for extra damage. The Devastator centerpiece has the first instance of automaton iconography directly inscribed onto the body of a unit. Above that, we see its head. For some reason, this ripped model has a red face plating, but the image and in-game footage confirms that this head is ordinarily the same color as the base trooper's head. This leads me to my next point. I believe that all the Devastator variants are based directly upon the earlier Trooper variants. This isn't a far-fetched theory, but it's not directly confirmed, so I'll just leave it out there. I believe that each Devastator variant is made based on the code or programming of whatever the automaton's equivalent to that is of the Troopers. You can see how I think this works with this diagram I made here. I assume that it would be more efficient to recycle the behavior of previous units that have that behavior built into them rather than start from scratch, but again, it's all speculation. Moving on from the base Devastator, we have the Rocket variant. This Devastator is extremely similar to the base Devastator, but what particularly sets it apart is the rocket pod mounted on its shoulder and back. The pod is mainly connected by 2 sets of wires plugged into the Devastator's midsection. This shows that the rocket pod is likely not an external attachment, but rather an actual direct implant into the structure of the Devastator itself, being wired to and powered by the Devastator's power source. As a result of this, it seems that an additional heatsink was added to the rocket pod so as to avoid overheating the main body. Now, the main rocket pod itself is split into 2 parts, the firing mechanism and the storage. The firing mechanism can store 12 rockets and fire them in salvos of 4. Interestingly, if we look at this animation of the Devastator firing, which is from an official Helldivers patch notes video, we see that they fire their rockets in a symmetrical pattern. I like that detail. It makes me feel a bit better about the fact that they don't fire them in rows of 3. Once the firing mechanism has been emptied, it reclines backward and connects to the storage, allowing for an additional 12 rockets. This totals the Rocket Devastator at a whopping 24 rockets, which doesn't sound like much on average, but can be significantly annoying when you have what feels like hundreds of them on the battlefield. Now, on the topic of the rockets themselves, when they are mid-air, they look like pretty standard rockets. However, on the firing mechanism of the Rocket Devastator itself, they have a gold color. It seems that before firing, these rockets are encased in some kind of container. Aside from the rocket pod, the Rocket Devastator retains all the standard features that the base Devastator has, with the only exception being a small depiction of a gear on its head that is removed to make space for the firing mechanism. Similar can be said about our next Devastator variant, the Heavy Devastator. The Heavy Devastator is a variant with more significant augmentations, however, they seem to be far more modular and dynamic. It has an ammo pack fitted onto its back, which is interesting as the machine gun still fires what appears to be plasma. I would presume that this backpack would contain a power source, evident by the 3 heat sinks on it. The heat from this power is somehow transferred into the main gun through this belt-like mechanism, where it then heats up gas stored in the gun itself, creating plasma. This unit is amongst the most powerful infantry units of the current automaton army. It can consistently fire devastating plasma bolts at a high rate for 3 seconds flat, with a 2-second cooldown. This, combined with their ballistic shield that has armor thickness of an actual tank, allows this bot to be one that should be a priority when neutralizing small infantry patrols, usually second to flare-firing troopers. While deadly, this unit was definitely designed with suppressing fire in mind, as it's not very accurate unless at close range. Otherwise, while dangerous, this is a relatively standard Devastator unit. The same cannot be said, however, for our final Devastator variant, the Berserker. I'll be honest, the Berserker is one of my favorite automaton units, as it seems to have the most defined personality. It's characterized by having its hands replaced by 2 giant chainsaws, presumably powered by a similar energy source used in plasma weapons. Now, as we can see, this is not your average Devastator, and I would actually like to propose a theory as to how these units may be produced. Now, if you played or know about the original Helldivers, you know that there was a unit dubbed the Berserker which filled a similar role. This unit is said to have obsessively tweaked and modified themselves to become killing machines. One would assume that the Berserker has done the same, however, I believe this is not the case. Lore-wise, I believe the Berserker fills a role closer to the Grotesques, also from Helldivers 1. They seem to be made by the collection of automaton scraps on the battlefield, reassembled into these presumably cheap and easy-to-make units. This is what I believe to make the most sense, as it would be the most strategic move on the part of the automatons. Something that would make this even more beneficial is the effect on enemy morale. Not only would this unit be cheap to make, be made in larger quantities that scale with the size of battles, and be a positive result of failed automaton operations, but this unit in particular also has the capacity to terrify humans, most often keeping a variety of human skulls attached to the scrap metal that it uses to decorate its head. Overall, this is one of my personal favorite automaton units, and thus the conclusion to the medium tier. With that being said, we now move on to the big guys, the ones that everyone knows about, the dreadnoughts, as some say, and, most of all, the Hulks. Hulks are the largest of the automaton units that could still fall under the categorization of quote-unquote infantry. They are bipedal units that are presumably the direct upgrades to the Devastators, even being as modular as those previous units, having multiple different options for weapons in particular. As of now, Hulks can only have flamethrowers, buzzsaws, fusion autocannons, and launchers, which can launch either missiles or firebombs if it's a part of the incineration core. Additionally, now's a great time to mention that in the first game, the cyborgs were heavily centric on how much one could mechanically alter their being. They used this concept to define their social hierarchy. Assuming that the automatons have some kind of sentience, it is likely that they would, of course, inherit this belief from their parents. With this, we can assume that Hulks are the most commemorated autonomous units among the automaton infantry ranks. This commemoration is displayed through several additional layers of mechanics and armor that encase what started out as a trooper all that time ago. The most prominent features on the Hulk are the pauldrons, chest armor, leg armor, and weapons. The chest armor is slanted downwards so as to deflect oncoming fire more effectively. It should be noted that this Gmod model is slightly inaccurate. The official image shows that there are 2 symbols present on the automaton. On the center, there is an automaton emblem, and on the right pauldron, there is the letter H from the automaton alphabet. I would of course presume that this stands for heavy, but it could have some kind of alternative meaning, as it is also seen on the Devastator. The pauldrons themselves are made of a red painted metal, which appears to be enhanced in comparison to the material that composes the rest of the body, specifically designed to deflect explosives such as thermite. Or at least, that is what's happened to me in my personal experience. On the top of the Hulk's main body, there are a set of 4 structures, which I would assume to be antennas. At first I thought they would be decoration, however they have small yellow heat sinks on them and have direct connections to the Hulk body. These may be used for remote communication with other sources like I mentioned earlier, or they may simply be used to expel more heat or something. I don't know, someone tell me in the comments please. One of the more weaker parts of its body is the heat sink that lies on its back. I would presume that such a large cooling mechanism would be needed so as to support the amount of power usage that such a unit would result in. Interestingly, the Jet Brigade variant of the Hulk has these heat sinks completely covered by the jetpack, which makes me think that the Jet Brigade variant of the Hulk uses the excess heat to power the jetpack mechanism. The Hulk's legs are pretty standard for an automaton unit, digitigrade in nature, and it has 3-toed feet for optimal stabilization and terrain traversal. This primarily mimics the foot structure of many birds in real life, in keeping with the digitigrade theme that has been seen so far. Now, one great point of interest on the Hulks is, of course, the weapons. There are 3 base Hulk variants that have different weapon combinations that correspond with their title. The Hulk Bruiser has a fusion autocannon for its right arm and a rocket launcher for its left arm. The Hulk Scorcher sports an alternative paint and decorative finish in line with the Berserker Devastator and utilizes a flamethrower and buzzsaw. Finally, the Hulk Obliterator, as its name suggests, is not necessarily the most dangerous Hulk to deal with, but definitely the most painful one. It uses dual rocket launchers and fires rockets at a higher rate than the Bruiser for maximum ragdolling efficiency. And it sports a flag atop its head to drive home the dominance that the Automaton Legion has in the field of ragdolling technology. Now, while these do seem to be set in stone, I believe that the Hulks, as it is with the Troopers and Devastators, are designed to be modular. In particular, I think the Hulks can technically mix and match weapons on each arm. This has the potential to lead to some unconventional situations. Honestly though, a Hulk with 2 buzzsaws would be crazy to fight against. Like, you could just make up for the lack of range by giving it a speed boost, or even a jetpack. Just make Jet Brigade Hulks have 2 buzzsaws. Now, we can't talk about the Hulk without talking about its one eye. This eye is the ultimate weak spot of the Hulk. Just one well-placed shot to the eye with just about any weapon will instantly kill it. But don't be fooled. Once it's collapsed, it's time to start running, as this unit is set to automatically explode upon death after a few seconds. Whether intentional or a happy accident, this explosion alone makes Hulks one of the most deadly infantry units amongst the automatons, let alone everything else that they have in their arsenal. The Factory Strider is the greatest of the automaton units. To start off, we first immediately see that it has digitigrade legs, a large body, and a small head, as well as multiple medium, heavy, and anti-tank armor plates. We also see that it has multiple eyes across its body. While at first you may only see the large one on its head that serves as a weak spot like the Hulk has, it also has one on each chin gun, along with some lights, and 2 on the cannon turret. Whether or not these are actually eyes is probably debatable, but considering that they look the exact same and are all strategically placed in locations where an individual would want eyes to be, I will go with this theory. The Factory Strider also has 3 small pieces of armor at its lower leg and foot, which are the exact same as the ones on the War Strider. This has the potential to indicate that these 2 are directly related. The primary ability the Factory Strider is made for is to remotely manufacture Devastators. I believe this to be one of the cornerstones of automaton invasions, especially in situations in which a particular swiftness is necessary. See, the Factory Strider is capable of birthing 4 Devastators per minute. At first, this doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 5,760 Devastators per day. That means, in a single week of 7 standard Super Earth days, a Factory Strider will produce 40,320 Devastators. Again, for a whole planet, this doesn't seem like much, but all the Automaton Legion would need to do is deploy 100 Factory Striders, and suddenly, they gain 4 million Devastators per week. And that's not including the countless other remote factories that will produce troopers, which can seemingly also be set up on a whim. Without a shadow of a doubt, the Factory Strider is strategically the most productive automaton that there is. Don't be fooled though when looking at this unit's primary use as a utility. It can be a deadly weapon, often deployed into active combat. The Factory Strider is equipped with a slightly modified version of the fusion cannon turret, the most powerful fusion weapon on the ground that we currently know of, and dual fusion Gatling guns. Now earlier I said that the Heavy Devastator was one of the most powerful automatons of the Devastator ranks. This is primarily because, while we don't often think of it, plasma weapons are actually extremely powerful. If the automatons had the capability to be as accurate in their shots as most Helldivers, or even most Sief troopers, the war, on ground infantry operations at least, would be a piece of cake for them. Essentially, any automaton unit from the weakest of troopers to the largest of Hulks has the capability to end a Helldiver with only a few plasma shots. With this in mind, you could imagine that, considering how inaccurate the automatons are, that basing weapons around a flurry of plasma bolts would be the most optimal solution to combat. However, I think this likely cannot be done due to power constraints, as automatons are seen frequently cooling their weapons, even when slow firing. The Factory Strider has no such limitation though. A larger size means larger and a higher amount of heat sinks and cooling vents, and that's what we see across its entire body from its lower legs to even the top of its head. This is what I believe allows the unit to fire what may be hundreds of plasma bolts at once. A theory about the Factory Strider that I would also like to propose is that it may be an automaton which has been further upgraded. This is probably likely to be untrue, maybe, but if it was, then the Factory Strider would also have the most honored position of the automatons, being the most covered in mechanics. This would play into some kind of theme of the Factory Strider being a kind of mother to the automatons or something. This is all speculation though, as the only real piece of evidence for this is the fact that Factory Striders chant with the automatons in their marching cadence. The automaton vehicles consist of two main groups, tanks and aircraft. The tanks are deployed against Helldivers on missions of medium difficulty or higher, being needed for missions of relatively high importance to the automatons. However, it is my personal belief that, unlike something like the Vox engine, the tanks were not made with use against Helldivers in mind, at least not primarily. It would seem that tanks in the automaton ranks are designed for warfare against smaller infantry, with telltale signs, of course, being the treads armed with spikes and the smaller gun on the Annihilator tank, which can only penetrate through small levels of armor. Ideally, the tanks are deployed in rocky or otherwise perforated environments taken a hold of by Sief soldiers, which the tank can bulldoze through, only being able to be stopped by a well-placed EAT round or grenade, which most Sief soldiers obviously won't have the wiggle room or expertise to do. Against Helldivers, however, they perform quite differently. Tanks work more as area denial rather than forward oppression when put up against Helldivers, a threat that needs to either be neutralized or avoided in order to proceed to the objective. In that regard, tanks often work as effective tools to get Helldivers behind cover, or forcing them to stop and input stratagem codes, allowing other units to flank if possible. Tactically, these tanks would be needed to be deployed at a distance on a flat plane in respect to the target Helldiver, who would then either be forced to either waste a stratagem or take cover. Then you need a unit like a Hulk, a few Devastators, or even a gunship to take them out while they're stuck. The aircraft in particular are our second group of vehicles, consisting only of the dropship and gunship. The overall pattern of an automaton aircraft is a long rectangular chassis with 4 directional turbines to fly. The dropship has magnets along the chassis and the gunship has a gun situated at the front. Ideally, I would assume something like the gunship against standard Sief forces would simply provide air support, mowing down groups of Sief soldiers with its rockets. However, against Helldivers, it works primarily as an oppression tool, making sure Helldivers who don't go out of their way to destroy them always have to be worried about them, because if they get distracted by something else, the gunship will neutralize them with ease, and of course the dropship just works to deploy units. Although it is quite versatile, and against Helldivers it can even be utilized for ambushes, as its immense speed allows it to deploy high-level, dangerous units before a Helldiver can even realize what's going on. These are all the factors that we will be taking into account when looking at all these units, and with that, we look at our first tank, the Annihilator tank. The Annihilator tank is characterized by its primary turret, which is one designed to pierce heavy armor. This unit definitely sees application against other Super Earth tanks, and maybe even air units if it could temporarily be used as artillery. Other than the FRV and the Bastion tank, and maybe the Gator though, we haven't really seen much major Helldiver armor, so it's likely that this and the other tank variants are still made to excel against infantry. This in particular is made clear by the way the treads on both the front and the sides are littered with small spikes, not substantial enough to break through other vehicle armor, but definitely enough to take on personnel. Any Helldiver who's gotten close enough to the chassis to touch it knows that this can be a very lethal threat. In addition to these spikes though, the Annihilator also has a smaller, low-power coaxial fusion machine gun used to counter threats close enough for the main turret to not be needed, but far to the extent where they they cannot be rammed. These features in particular partially mimic Super Earth designs, which itself is a call to the fact that the automatons are of Super Earth origin, being derived from mining tools provided to the cyborgs. We can assume that when said mining tools were given consciousness, they pulled from the designs of their forefathers for such heavy armor. Aside from these, there are also slightly heavier plasma machine guns mounted on the hull. This was almost undoubtedly put in place to have a weapon that wasn't forced to face the same axis as the main cannon. This extra machine gun can be used if the cannon is firing on heavy armor to the left or right, while also being approached from the front. Now, the Annihilator tank is a big vehicle, and it has to be powered somehow. With the automaton's ability to use fusion energy, we can assume that they use that, and so the Annihilator tank needs to get rid of some excess heat. It does this through what appears to be glowing heat sinks on the back. Interestingly, however, for some reason there's also 2 heat sinks on the barrel of the cannon. This is likely to avoid the overheating of the barrel itself. While a lot of excess heat can exit from the opening of the barrel, the sheer power of the cannon is likely enough to warrant 2 added heat sinks to expel even more heat. Elsewhere, towards the midsection of the tank, as usual it is adorned with red reinforced plating marked with automaton insignia. This likely serves to protect the more vital parts of the tank, which doubles as intimidations toward its foes. Overall, the Annihilator tank has most of what you'd expect from automaton design, and the same can be said for our next tank, the Shredder tank. The chassis of the Shredder tank is identical to the Annihilator tanks, with the main thing missing being the auxiliary fusion machine gun mounted on the hull. The primary addition is, of course, the new turret, being an array of 4 high-powered fusion machine guns. It's a smaller, more sleek design, likely to allow the thing to turn on a dime. This does make it an overall easier to destroy target than the Annihilator's turret, but it compensates for this by being a much more deadly threat to infantry on the ground. I would assume a situation where the Shredder tank acts as it was intended is one where it's deployed to counter a large group of Sief soldiers on the battlefield. Its squad machine guns would make quick work of any of them who were out of cover. Against the special forces of the Helldivers, it's a similar story. It forces Helldivers to quickly find cover, else be, well, shredded by those guns. The main way that the guns are utilized is through quick but controlled precision bursts. When targeting particular targets like the Helldivers, however, it's likely that the more common format used is the one where it essentially sweeps the area, firing a continuous stream of bullets across the area for about 2 seconds before cooling down and either firing in that pattern again or switching back to precision. The main reason I believe this sweeping pattern works better against Helldivers is because the main goal is to oppress them rather than kill them as it would be with Sief soldiers. The sweeping motion will catch any Helldivers, who have much better mobility than soldiers mind you, out of cover much easier than a precision burst might be able to do so. The turret itself consists of 4 heavy fusion machine guns with the little heatsink things from before at the end of the barrels placed ahead of 2 plates of level 5 armor, which itself protects the main body and heatsinks of a level 3 armor rating. On this, we see 4 heatsinks, 2 on the back and 2 minor ones on either side. Near these is a variety of exposed tubing, which I find quite odd since usually this is a big no-no in terms of trying to defend your weak spots. However, I assume they sacrificed armor covering these parts in favor of better mobility. Overall, if you had to assign an automaton unit to the task of chaff clearing, 9 times out of 10 it'd probably be the Shredder tank. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we have a unit designed for priority targeting. This unit is the Barrager tank. The Barrager tank is the most basic of the automaton tanks. They have the same chassis and one kind of monolithic attachment on top of it. This attachment is a rocket array with 33 barrels, each of these firing a slim, heavy rocket with a level 6 armor penetration value. While its name implies that it too is meant to be a chaff clearing unit using a barrage of rockets to do so, I believe that this unit, while still capable of doing that, sees a great use in precision operations, where a unit of high armor rating needs to be broken through. Even a single rocket does substantial damage and breaks through a substantial amount of armor, and so on the front lines, this tank could be deployed against other Helldiver vehicles, both airborne and on the ground, such as Eagles or Bastion tanks. this is one of the things that implies that there is still more in the Super Earth arsenal that we simply have not seen, as the main game consists of Special Forces operations, whereas there could be a whole other array of weapons, vehicles, and more simply not made for the Helldivers, but rather the Sief soldiers. Otherwise, the Barrager tank is simply another pattern of automaton tank, and the final one that we currently know of. With that, we move on to the other type of automaton vehicle, the airborne ships. The first of them is the dropship, which is a long, kind of rectangular design with 4 thrusters being used to propel it upward. These thrusters are specially armored at a level 5 armor value in order to protect them from small arms. However, heavy artillery can easily take it down swiftly. The main part of this unit is, of course, the mechanism that it uses to carry other automaton units using some kind of magnet system. This is so powerful that it allows it to not only carry infantry units and hulks, but also entire tanks and heavier units like a factory strider with ease. This very unit is what allows the automatons to have their particular style of war, barraging heavy units like the Helldivers and likely larger groupings of units like the Sief soldiers with units much heavier than them in rapid succession. It also allows for the tactical deployment of smaller scale units when needed though, as with its versatility, it's really the workhorse of the automaton fleet. I mean, thinking about it, this thing can be used for all kinds of operations: insertion into an operation, blitz against a tough formation, transporting troopers from one battlefield to the next, maybe even things like transporting resources, ammo, and energy sources across planetside if need be. At this rate, I'd probably say, like, if you remove the unit from the automatons entirely, like the factory strider, they'd probably struggle for a little while but persist. But if you removed all of their dropships, they'd probably fall in a few days. Overall, the dropship is truly one of the more versatile parts of the automaton army, a side of them which we really don't see that often. However, the next unit is a variation of it which once again takes on a directly offensive purpose. This unit is the gunship. The gunship is seemingly a modified and significantly smaller version of the dropship made solely for offensive purposes. With ease, it glides across the skies as it barrages any ground forces with a hail of plasma bolts and high explosive rockets. The main chassis that originally had the dropship's docking platform instead has a thinner, armored section which has been trimmed down for better mobility. With this, it can use its thrusters to easily maneuver its way around artillery fire while still getting a few good hits in. Notably, it has 2 antennas on it that weren't present before on the dropship, which implies that this has a greater connection to the greater automaton communications array. Many speculate that most automaton units are being directly controlled/commanded from remote locations, or even one greater hive mind, and antennas like this, which are present randomly on some units and likewise not present on others, implies at least some units are being remotely controlled like this. The first thing we notice about the War Strider are the 2 large guns that are mounted to its sides, which bear a striking resemblance to the Helldivers' railguns. While this is the case, it seems that the appearance of this weapon may partially be misleading, as it's hooked up to some kind of gas canister. As we have in previous units, we may assume that this unit is based on a system that heats up gas using an energy source to create plasma. It is possible that the magnets may come into play somehow, maybe through the use of some kind of hybrid weaponry, but as far as I know, there is no real parallel to this gun that has ever been documented. Additionally, many have speculated that the automaton weaponry are just actual ballistics with red tracers, and many more have said that it's just laser weaponry and we should suspend our disbelief. If I'm being honest, that is probably the right answer. However, based on the model that I myself have personally speculated, if I were to attempt to label the parts of the gun, I would call this the gas canister, this the energy source, and this the magnets, if applicable. This weapon is said to have previously been an anti-tank emplacement, which was modified and attached to the War Strider, which hints towards the War Strider being less so standardized and more so an experiment. More on that later. The War Strider's secondary weapons are a set of grenade launchers on its back. In combat, it will utilize them by firing a volley of 10 grenades in a large area. This strategy of saturation seems to be pretty resource heavy for the rate of success, but I would suppose that these grenades may be pretty cheap, as they are the same ones that the standard infantry are provided with. With that, we can also assume that the Warstrider is particularly made to deal with smaller infantry such as the Siege soldiers, although it is of course applicable to combat with Helldivers. This launcher can fire high explosive grenades in salvos of 10, a strategy most effective for area denial and crowd control. It seems that about 2 grenades could fit inside each hole. Otherwise, I'm not too sure how it would reload other than the use of an outside mechanism. Moving to the main body, we see 2 locations of particular interest. These 2 red spots appear to be eyes, as it is with the rest of the automaton units. It would most obviously make sense for the light at the top to be the main eye, or at least the light sensor, while the lower one may be a different kind of sensor for other forms of perception. In between the 2 lights is a large plate of red armor, a recurring theme in many automaton units. We see this same material used as the Warstrider's guards on its ankles, knees, and back legs, as well as around the gas canister. I would really like to hear your theories on what this red material could be, assuming that it's not just painted, and even then, it does appear to have a different texture. On the back of the Warstrider's main body, we see 4 lights on either side of it. These lights are likely to be some kind of status indicator, possibly even to indicate that it is functional in the first place. Along these lights, we see 3 heat sinks to cool the Warstrider off to avoid overheating, as it is with the majority of automatons. Near these heat sinks, and across the body as a whole, are a variety of labels in the automaton language, primarily the ones that say maintenance hatch, everything for the collective, and the letter H in the automaton language, presumably meaning heavy. This is definitely speculation, but the high presence of the maintenance hatch signs may indicate that the Warstrider is far more of an experimental automaton than usual, as it may need to be worked on more often. It could also explain why we don't really see that much of them, even though we see so many Scout Striders across the whole army. It is, of course, important to mention the resemblance that the Warstrider bears to the Scout and Reinforced Scout Striders. It is definitely possible that the Warstrider is a direct upgrade from the Reinforced Scout Strider, if not at the very least based upon its design. This is, of course, most evident in the Warstrider's legs, which are digitigrade in the same way that the Scout Strider's legs are. Most notably, the same kind of cables that are seen on the Scout Strider can also be seen on the Warstrider's joints, specifically the ankles and middle knees. As we speculated in the past, these cables could either be hydraulics, pneumatics, wires, or a combination of all of those. These are all fields that can and have been applied in robotics. In fact, it is even worth mentioning that this kind of leg structure has found use in robotics, primarily for ease of storage and for better flexibility. Another thing that relates the Warstrider to the Scout Strider is that what appears to be the Warstrider's central power unit is nearly identical to the Scout Strider's, which is what leads me to believe that it may be a direct upgrade. Building directly off old models like this is not uncommon in robotics, although it really depends on the situation. It can definitely save you on some resources, but it also comes with the possibility of keeping some of the flaws that were present in previous iterations, if there were any at all. Overall, the Warstrider is one of the more interesting automaton units to be sure, and definitely one that would terrify any lone Helldiver on the battlefield, but as with most all things on the automaton front, without its comrades it may as well be useless. This unit is surely made to pair well with the other automatons, as area denial is much more effective against the enemy when you have infantry or other heavy units confining them to that particular area. It, really goes in with the theme of the automatons and the collective. They're really useless until you have 70 of them facing you all at once. The Jet Brigade's existence was discovered by Super Earth after an attack on Matar Bay. They discovered the name by deciphering it in automaton communications. The Jet Brigade was made as a response to the development of the Democracy Space Station, with Court Bay as their staging grounds. The automatons scavenged some jump pack technology from dead Helldivers and other sources on the battlefield. Using this, they manufactured a whole brigade of units with their own jump packs that come on a separate fleet. For a time, this force consisted of only modified troopers attempting attacks on the DSS Logistics Hub and the Deep Mantle Forge complex on Tarsh and Claurel respectively, and even ones on the DSS itself. These attacks were promptly repelled by the forces of the Federation of Super-Earth, and eventually the Jet Brigade mostly faded into obscurity. That was until the automatons began to attack Malevelon Creek, bringing in new and improved Jet Brigade variants, those being jet versions of the Hulk and Devastators. At the time of recording, the Jet Brigade is nowhere to be seen on the Galactic War map and was last seen defending the streets of the Cybersand megafactories. Overall, the Jet Brigade has a rich history of terror when it comes to engagements against the Federation of Super-Earth, and the technology they use for this is of great interest. We start with the base unit that the Jet Brigade started with, the Jet Trooper. Now, as we know, Jet Brigade technology is based on Super-Earth Scavenge jump pack technology. This is only partially reflected in its design though. We see that the Brigade jump pack has 2 thrusters just as the Helldivers one has. However, it appears much bulkier and even rough in its design. We see that its version of whatever is contained in these 2 bumps on the Helldivers jump pack is far larger, with the tanks being seen from the outside. It may imply that either they are unable to reproduce the same effectiveness with the same amount of fuel that the Super-Earth jump pack uses, or that they do this for a more robust ability. Regardless, we see that this system works with a kind of liquid or gas fuel contained in 2 canisters. These are connected to the base of the jump pack, which routes this fuel down to the thrusters. Now, I have no idea what kind of fuel would be needed for something like this, but of course we can narrow it down by the fact that it's extra combustible. In fact, the Jet Brigade automatons were initially specially designed to be a kind of suicide bomber. The Trooper variants will always jetpack on top of Helldivers in an attempt to get Helldivers to shoot them and blow them up, setting the Helldivers themselves ablaze. If they miss, they will run at full sprint at the targeted Helldiver to achieve the same goal. With this in mind, I'm not entirely sure what the fuel could be, but some sources say that it may be something called kerosene, which is a quite combustible material itself. It could be something else, but overall, I'm not too sure what powers jetpacks. Moving on, we have the Jet Devastators. These are pretty much standard, being Devastators like normal with scaled up versions of the Trooper jetpacks. These appear to be an exact 1-to-1 upscaling, which is odd since usually machinery can't do that, but this is passable. We can assume that the Jet Devastator works the same as the Trooper, just with a need for some more fuel. We also have the Jet Hulk. It is simply a chrome-finished Hulk with a jetpack on top of its heat sinks. Because of this, I like to think that the Hulk's jetpack uniquely works as a kind of exhaust for the Hulk, expelling excess heat along with the fuel used for the jetpack. The design of the jetpack itself is different and might even reflect that use. We see the 2 fuel tanks now surrounded by the metal and more directly connected to the Hulk with pipes. It can be assumed that these extra tubes are plugged directly into the Hulk and transferring heat, pushing it outside when the Hulk uses the jump pack. We can also assume that these tanks contain the same fuel as the previous iterations, only contained in this way due to the larger design of the Hulk itself. Interestingly, on the Hulk's jump pack there is some kind of antenna. What this is for, I really have no idea, but it would be cool to see some speculation about this in the comments. Overall, the Jet Brigade is quite the threat, being the side of the automatons dedicated to rushing you down and throwing as many bodies at you as possible. However, they are only one side of the equation, as the automatons have also developed a second sub-faction of units dedicated to one thing and one thing only: incineration. The automaton incineration core came quickly and suddenly. Where the threat of the Jet Brigade was built up slowly over time, the automatons must have found that technique to yield negligible results. And so, when they built up their next sub-faction, they immediately sent them into multiple colonized planets, setting the homesteads of the many Super-Earth-owned planets ablaze. The staging ground of the core is not known, nor is their origin. My best assumption, though, based on the fact that their first deployment was on colony planets, is that they were developed as a faction of terror, as opposed to the reason that the Jet Brigade was developed as a tactical backlash to the DSS. This is also probably the reason for their sudden appearance, as an ambush like this is far more effective in terms of terror. After their first appearance, they became a staple of automaton offensive operations, being deployed to populated and unpopulated planets alike. At the time of recording, the Incineration Core had been deployed on planets Aurora Bay and Chu, making up a strategic blockade following Super Earth's failure to capture Cyberstan. These two planets make up a strategic FTL line closer to Super Earth that can be used for easy access to Cyberstan should it be freed. The automatons have likely stationed the Incineration Core there in an attempt to scare the Federation away from ever attempting to attack Cyberstan again. However, something tells me that the Federation of Super Earth won't be backing down anytime soon. Now, the most basic of the Incineration Core units is, of course, the Pyro Trooper. This is simply a trooper given a flamethrower and a backpack to support it. Although it is not present in this ported model here, the pack is connected to the flamer by a black wire that routes fuel into the weapon, which will ignite the fuel as it exits the nozzle, creating a stream of flame to shoot out, burning all that stands in this trooper's way. In addition to the flamer, the Pyro Trooper also carries a few incendiary grenades. It'll use these to, as usual, flush Helldivers out of cover with an added bit of potency. That's not the only explosive capability that the Pyro Trooper has, though, as it possesses a weakness that most all flame units portrayed in video games all tend to have, that being a bright red fuel tank that, when shot, ignites into a ball of flame, scalding all Helldivers in the area. Of course, when something like this is done, I always mentally ask from the in-lore perspective, why not just paint it the same color as the body, white in this case, to make it harder to spot? And I'd usually let it slide and not talk about it at all when it comes to tankier enemies, but I mean, this is a trooper. It doesn't matter where you hit, the bullets are probably going to penetrate through and hit the fuel anyway. I suppose in that case, it doesn't matter at all what color it is, but I don't know, it could just be chalked up to the automaton's design philosophy. And on the topic of seemingly unnecessary things, we also see that the Pyro Trooper has some kind of respirator attached to its mouth. Why does it need this? It's a robot. Does it need this to stay alive? Does the fuel that the fire use interfere with it if it quote-unquote breathes it in? Does it take in the air around it to produce more fuel? Is it just a random design? I have no idea. Something I do know is that this trooper has a more standard variant, being the Incineration Core version of the Rocket Raider. However, it is merely a reskin with a launcher that fires a slightly different plasma projectile. Now, the Incineration Core has also given some love to the Devastators, a class of automaton that, in my opinion, has the most basic designs of all the automaton units, barring the vehicles, of course. So how does this sub-faction change them? Well, it gives them a new paint job. Yeah, not exactly a major design change like with the jetpack and fuel tanks, but the main variation comes in the form of the mechanics, which have been greatly altered. For one, we have a version of the Heavy Devastator which looks identical, however, it fires some kind of special incendiary ammunition, likely a modified version of the plasma weaponry that they previously would use. Now, I'm not sure how plasma could be modified in a way to make things burn even more than the heat of that extremely hot state of matter already does, although my best assumption is that it mixes in some kind of physical material into the weapon that may cause fire. The other Devastator is the one called the Conflagration Devastator, which is actually kind of unique in its design, as it has the appearance of a standard Devastator but has still been equipped with a shield. This is most evidently due to the nature of its weapon, as while it appears just the same as a standard Devastator's cannon, it actually is a kind of shotgun, devoid of all plasma entirely. This weapon fires a spray of burning hot material, likely some kind of metal, in the direction direction that the Devastator aims it at. This is one of the most potent weapons that the Automaton Legion is armed with, which is surprising since in terms of raw one-hit kill potential, this weapon genuinely stands aside the cannon turret. The only thing that limits this weapon is range, and even then it'll set you on fire regardless of whether or not all or a single pellet hits you. This unit was one of the most jarring changes to the automatons with the incineration core, and while it was definitely difficult at first, it's actually genuinely what I'd like to see more of in sub-factions, things that genuinely force players to adapt, in ways that just aren't, straight up unfair. The final incineration core unit is the Hulk Firebomber. This unit is pretty straightforward. It's just a Hulk obliterator with a white paint job whose left arm is a flamethrower and right arm is a grenade launcher that fires incendiary impact grenades. In terms of gameplay, this was a huge addition, as it is essentially a walking incendiary mortar, forcing Helldivers to target it if they don't want to suffer too badly. However, in terms of lore and design, this is honestly pretty normal. It's really just another Hulk configuration, giving them a bit more variety. Now, the cyborgs are one of the Federation's oldest arch-enemies. This presumably stems all the way back to when their home planet of Cyberstan was first discovered or colonized. It is a harsh, mostly frozen planet that consistently has a thin sheet of snow across its terrain. We can determine that this planet is located slightly farther away from its sun, or is currently undergoing some kind of global ice age, possibly a combination of both and many other factors. What's most important about this planet, though, is that it is host to a variety of seemingly important resources within its crust. When the Federation of Super-Earth took this place, they set up some kind of mining operation to harvest the planet's natural resources. The individuals that the Federation populated the planet with to work in these mines can be assumed to have been dissidents, or even normal citizens who simply had a negative affinity toward the Federation. Either way, they didn't take kindly to being sent to these mines, both mentally and physically. The conditions of their work were extremely hot, and thus harsh enough to prompt them to cybernetically modify their own bodies in order to be more effective at their job. It's possible that at first these started as just respirators, temperature stabilizers, and prosthetic limbs, which itself could have escalated to prosthetics outfitted with mining equipment, and so on and so forth, until they reached a point of being an entirely new race of cyborgs. The negative feelings that this race harbored towards Super-Earth festered for so long that they managed to successfully secede and, for a time, remained separate. But, of course, as they remained an independent faction, their disdain towards Super-Earth grew. This kept becoming worse until we reached a discrepancy, where Super-Earth claims that a member of the Cyborg Legion had detonated a bomb in one of Super-Earth's districts, killing many civilians. However, it cannot be confirmed that this individual was actually affiliated with the Legion itself, although Super-Earth insists as much. This was the event that incited the First Galactic War, which was promptly fought and lost by the cyborgs. Following their defeat, they were sent right back to where they started, the mines on Cyberstan, more as prisoners of war than residents though. This was the status quo for about 100 years, and this is where the new information we learned during the Second Galactic War comes into play. See, the cyborgs began plotting their revenge against Super-Earth for their second imprisonment, and the main component of this plan, as it was with the Illuminate, was placed right into their lap by Super-Earth themselves. During their imprisonment, the cyborgs became more of an asset than anything, being a source of resources from Cyberstan for Super-Earth. To increase the efficiency of the procurement of these resources, the cyborgs were provided a variety of mining tools from Super-Earth, one of which being a series of autonomous mining robots. The cyborgs would use these as the basis for the first ever prototypes of what we now know as the automatons. They worked on this force of self-replicated assault robots for years before sending them away from the planet on what was known as Vessel 00. As they continued to automatically replicate off-world, the automatons eventually came and took Cyberstan by force, and thus the cyborgs were finally free, only engaging in field combat once Super Earth's forces reached the recently taken Cyberstan itself. And so that is the full origin story of the cyborgs and the automatons as we know them, with the most recent information being of course the true nature of the automatons as repurposed mining equipment from Super Earth. The way I see it, this follows the theme that was also seen in the recent origin of the current state of the Illuminate, where the only reason they're here in the Second Galactic War was because of Super Earth's actions in opening the wormhole, and also the Terminids, where they are literally products of Super Earth's own experimentation. And it's cool to think that this is why the automatons' designs are based on skulls, as it is likely that the series of autonomous mining robots had Super Earth's skulls in their design as well. Now that we have the basics of what the cyborgs are out of the way, we can start to analyze the actual units, the first of which being the Radical. The cyborg dubbed the Radical is the first unit that we've seen in their ranks since their reappearance on the battlefield in the Second Galactic War. They come in two male and female variants, but are roughly the same all around. Of course, the primary feature that we see on their bodies in terms of augmentation is actually the same kind of red wires seen on the automatons themselves. This seems to imply that the automatons are powered in a way similar to the cyborgs themselves. However, a way that they significantly differ is in what appears to be their power source. Where in the automatons, this was likely to be in the head or torso, the cyborgs clearly utilize their own heart, or have an artificial heart as their power source instead. We see that this heart extends outside of the body and has a small handle where it can seemingly be removed and altered if need be. From this heart, a tube wraps around the back and connects to a system of wires or tubes based on the human spine. This structure doesn't exactly mimic the human spine for obvious reasons, but I can assume that it also does help to augment the individual's strength and speed. Along with that, the Radical also has both of its legs entirely replaced, which is an augment we can assume works in conjunction with the artificial spine to increase strength when working on mining operations, and also to increase resistance to the high temperatures deeper within the planet. Now, an interesting feature we see on the Radical is a plethora of surgery marks showing that their brain, shoulders, abdomen, and back of their neck had cybernetic implants placed within. We can assume that their purpose is to simply increase the effectiveness of their organs. However, they could also have entire artificial organs like with their heart. We also see up at the Radical's face that its mouth and nose has been replaced with what is likely to be a respirator. This was likely needed to avoid inhaling cancerous particles and such when in the mines. Below this respirator, there is a large amount of wires leading into an opening below their ears, likely in order to power the many augments that they were subject to there. One of these being the implanting of some kind of bright LED lights in their eyes, causing them to shine brightly. This was most obviously put there for intimidation, and it is likely that they weren't there during their time as slaves. Aside from all those augments, the Radical is also equipped with a shotgun based on something similar to the plasma weapons that the automatons are armed with. However, these are slightly different in coloration, being a slight orange for some reason. This could be because it's based on their very own mining equipment. Now, the Radical is seemingly the base version of the current cyborgs, and thus they are actually mass-produced within what is dubbed an assembly unit within the megafactories. How this works is that the cyborgs are grown in a mass amount of tubes attached to some kind of centrifuge that is constantly spinning. This is all powered by highly combustible hydrogen, which is put through a cooling system before being sent to power the main unit. I don't exactly know how this assembly unit works, but I can assume that it's some kind of cloning process where they are grown in a way which likely explains why they mostly all look the same. The primary way in which they differ comes in the form of a higher commander, which has been dubbed the Agitator. The Agitator is the commander amongst the cyborgs. It is armed with a new weapon that is much more powerful than standard automaton weaponry. It fires a single bolt at a time and does some significant damage. The wiki claims that this is a plasma-infused weapon with hydrogen, which is what makes it more powerful, though I'm not entirely sure. The main feature of the Agitator is its armor, which covers the previously exposed skin. This was obviously implemented because these individuals are more important to be kept alive working as commanders for even the automatons. Their main function is actually to command the automatons in some way. Something is implanted within them that wirelessly interacts with the automatons' behavior systems, making them move much faster and more tactically. I'm not sure why this is necessary to be implemented within the automatons when they could just be programmed to be like this at all times. It's seemingly a waste of resources to implement it into both a cyborg and an automaton when you could just implement it into one. This could actually prove that the automatons are actually sentient, being literally motivated by the commands of their leaders, or it could just be an oversight. An interesting fact about the Agitator is that its entry into the Helldivers 2 PlayStation page actually confirms that the automatons use plasma weaponry, or at least this one does. Overall, the Agitator is merely a variant of the Radical, really just one with more armor and a helmet that looks like Isaac Clarke's from Dead Space. However, there is another cyborg that may also just be a Radical with more armor. However, the level of armor it has is much, much greater, this unit being the Vox engine. The Vox engine is the greatest amongst the cyborgs. While at first you may assume that it is a newly added automaton, in truth, this is a cyborg contained within a large shell. This shell is not really designed to be offensive, although it definitely achieves that regardless. Rather, this machine is more of a propaganda device, yelling at the top of its lungs with cyborg propaganda. Now, the Vox engine itself is seemingly based on the Agitator's design, with the helmet design that looks like it's from Dead Space, and the general color and just, the design of the armor. It bears quite a bit of a resemblance to the Factory Strider as well, but its heavier armored parts are a slightly lighter shade of red. There are 4 large treads, 2 on the left and right, that allow the Vox engine to maneuver. It moves pretty slow, but faster than something like the Factory Strider, and definitely fast enough to avoid being shot in certain weak spots, those being the many heat sinks that the Vox engine uses to expel excess heat. This heat definitely doesn't come from the energy needed for movement though. In fact, all of this excess heat seemingly comes from the power generated to power its various weapons. It has plasma miniguns and 2 huge cannons, which the wiki has dubbed plasma micro culverins. These do massive damage, one-shotting most Helldivers very annoyingly, and if it wasn't bad enough, it also has a non-energy based weapon on its back, 2 couplings of high explosive anti-tank missile launchers that send out a volley of what the wiki calls Icarus missiles. These work in a way like mortars, where they are telegraphed in a large line ahead of the Vox engine itself. These have killed many a Helldiver dug in behind cover thinking that they were safe outside the Vox engine's line of sight. They were not safe outside the Vox engine's line of sight. Now, the Vox engine does actually have a big weakness. See, it has a set of 3 heat sinks on its underside. However, if these heat sinks are for whatever reason disabled, the Vox engine has a backup system that opens a vent to manually vent out steam for the excess heat caused by the weapons. A grenade in this vent will generate so much heat that it causes an entire overload of heat in the system, to the point where it blows up the entire machine. It's not easy, but it's better than slowly getting through its armor. Once the Vox engine begins to melt down, it will actually eject the sarcophagus that the cyborg is contained in, which was working as the Vox engine's face. The cyborg within it remains lifeless, so I'm not entirely sure why it needs to do this in the first place. Regardless, we see that the cyborg is strapped in with its legs removed and its torso and possibly arms only being left within the sarcophagus. It's seemingly connected through all these tubes, which is quite odd, but it does make sense considering the Radical's own design design with all of the tubes on it. Overall, the Vox engine is one of the most dangerous and numerous units on the battlefield, and it's the latest in what I hope to be a long line of new cyborg units in the overall automaton faction. Let's start with what we know about the Illuminate, colloquially known as the squids and scientifically called the squith, as a baseline. Originally an aquatic species, they have become a civilization which has lasted several hundred thousands of years, much longer than humanity's time as an organized civilization. Because of this, they have had ample time to develop a wide variety of advanced technology far beyond that of human capability. And of course, because of their great technology, humans just had to go to war with them. The story goes that the Illuminate and the Federation of Super-Earth met as factions that were initially neutral towards each other. However, after a while, the Federation had noticed that the Illuminate had access to a great amount of weapons of mass destruction, and thus Super-Earth saw this as reason enough to declare war upon them. However, of course, knowing the Federation of Super-Earth, it is likely that rather than being out of a fear of mass destruction, which, as far as we know, the Illuminate never intended on acting upon, it is likely that Super-Earth saw the alien race with far superior technology and decided that sharing wasn't going to be an option. This is exemplified even more by the fact that, following the end of the First Galactic War, the Illuminate were made clear to have been forced to forfeit all of their technology that, and I quote, could be used as weapons to the Federation of Super-Earth. Following this, the Illuminate were essentially eradicated, pushed to near extinction, with only a few groups of survivors fleeing into unknown space. Now, in the Second Galactic War, we can confidently say that the Illuminate that are attacking us are in fact very malicious. While in the First Galactic War, it seemed that the Illuminate may not have initially been hostile, in the second it had become clear that the Illuminate have their intentions set on revenge, most evident by the fact that they abducted millions of people to turn into mindless freaks, but we'll get to that in a bit. The fact is, similar to the automatons, the Illuminate seek revenge for the wrongs that the Federation of Super-Earth enacted upon them in the past. And so, with that being said, as always, I've created a diagram to show the positions of all the units and where they fit into each other. With that being said, we start with the brunt of the Illuminate forces, the voteless. Voteless is the colloquial term used to describe the individuals that the endless waves of mutated humans are composed of. This name is obviously satire, but I assume that in the universe the soldiers and citizens take it completely seriously, and that's probably because they are actually really dangerous. When it comes to playing as Helldivers with access to all that special tech and really just a bunch of ways to defend yourself from smaller threats like this, they are pretty easy to kill. However, it should be noted that, taking armor into account, a voteless can end a Helldiver's life in about 3 to 4 swipes. One could imagine that a single voteless would have no problem tearing through a small crowd of unarmed or even lightly armed civilians. The source of this strength found in the voteless seems to be the result of some kind of forced mutation, induced by means defined by Super-Earth as Illuminate experimentation. It is not apparently clear what the purpose of this experimentation is just yet, but as we reach the later stages of the voteless mutation, I will form a hypothesis based on their appearance. What we do know about this mutation is that it somehow allows its victims to somewhat retain their consciousness. We see in certain animations that the citizens taken over by the voteless in their last moments will engage in deliberate gestures like saluting to the Helldivers that neutralized them. This may also imply that many victims are aware of their situation and are grateful to said Helldivers that they salute to for removing them from it. The reason for retaining of consciousness, I believe, is linked to the reason that the voteless exist in the first place, but first, on the appearance of the voteless, the light variant most evidently has its 2 hands replaced with 2 large claws. These claws appear to be somewhat fragile, in a way kind of soft like flesh, but make no mistake, it appears that these claws are supported by substantially dense bones. As I explained earlier, they kill Helldivers quite easily. Aside from this strength, the mutation that the voteless have undergone has caused cause their skin to become moist and slimy, almost permeable. These are the properties that can also be used to describe the skin of many amphibious and aquatic animals. One such animal whose skin appears similar to this is the squid, or more generally, cephalopods. With that context, the fleshy appendages that make up its fingers start to make a lot more sense, seemingly being tentacles of some kind. Aside from that though, we see that the early stage voteless have some kind of mask covering their face. This mask could be a growth induced by the mutation, but rather than that, I believe that it might actually be a mask that was implanted onto the voteless before they were mutated in the first place. The mask itself does have some attachments that allow the victim to breathe, however, they are styled a lot more like gills, in keeping with the Illuminate's overall aquatic theme. Finally, we have the eyes, which are bright blue, as if they were somehow replaced with LEDs, and I honestly have no idea why they are like this. It could be possible that maybe the inside of their head was implanted with something that generates light, or maybe the mutation just does this, being some kind of bioluminescence, or maybe they're compound eyes or something, but I'm not sure why this would be necessary in any way, as it only really serves to make the voteless more easily spotted by hostile forces. The voteless mutation is one that is gradual, one that comes in stages, and what we've seen so far, as hard as it may be to believe, is merely an early stage of an alteration that will eventually run much deeper. And so we move on to the next stage of this mutation, one I've simply dubbed the medium stage. What we immediately notice about the medium level progression of the voteless mutation is, of course, the flesh that the voteless is composed of has grown a considerable amount. This may show us that the mutation that the Illuminate have caused in what used to be these people seems to multiply cells. In a way, it seems to operate like a cancer, where the DNA of the victims have been altered and the many limits of cell proliferation removed. This is also evident in the claws, which have grown to be much longer and still surprisingly sturdy for their fleshy appearance. Another development in the medium voteless is the mask becoming seemingly slightly larger and notably being dug into the victim's nostrils. As I mentioned earlier, the mask has openings that are styled like gills, which allow for the unit to breathe, and this essentially cements the idea that the voteless have in some way been implanted in a way that reaches deep into their circulatory system, or alternatively, the mutation may be designed to merge with the mask after a certain point of development. This second theory is definitely supported by the fact that, draped over the mask, we see what appears to be tentacles of some kind, or at the very least, at this point in development, some fleshy tendrils. We never find out the reason for this, although it is in part the reason why the Illuminate have been assigned the colloquial designation of squids, and of course that their main species is literally called the squith. And so that brings us to the final level of the voteless mutation, which is of course called the heavy level. One would assume that this level shows the voteless fully realized, but I don't think that's the case just yet. We see, as described before, the tissue has rapidly proliferated, almost entirely encasing the top half of the victim. And as for the face, we see it as completely developed into some kind of Cthulhu-like abomination. The mask is by now completely submerged into the voteless flesh, with the tentacles on the face being fully developed. Additionally, for some reason it opens some kind of third eye, the reason for which is completely a mystery to me. Otherwise, everything else that has been said about the previous iteration subsequently applies to this one. Now, another thing about the voteless that we may analyze is their actual in-game behavior. Due to their nature as cannon fodder, we see they will relentlessly charge toward hostile units, retaining only their basic motor skills and their consciousness, but easily being knocked off balance with ballistic weapons. Obviously, these units are meant to be chafe, but I believe that this was not actually their intended purpose. See, the Illuminate were fairly pissed after their near extinction at the hands of Super Earth. Rightly so. It's with this in mind that I form my theory as to what the voteless are. See, as the few Illuminate fled, their first priority was, of course, to repopulate their numbers, but Of course, this also came with a burning hot rage toward the Federation of Super-Earth because of what they had done. It's because of this that they wanted to find a way to increase their numbers quickly so that they could lead a new army to Super-Earth. I believe they chose to do this by secretly abducting Super-Earth citizens to experiment with the human genome to see how they could get to replicating the Illuminate species, the Squith themselves, using only the other intelligent and sapient life forms that they knew of. If you think about it, in their situation, this makes a lot of sense. Even with breeding camps, reproduction to numbers that would allow for a large army to match the Federation would take far more than hundreds of years, maybe even thousands, and that's assuming that most individuals live decently long. With this method, the Illuminate could have an army up as soon as they figured out how to convert humans to Squith, but here's the thing. I think they actually never figured it out. I think the truth is the Illuminate were actually going to fail this from the very beginning, as they only managed to create hostile abominations. However, instead of slowly dying out in deep space, an opportunity presented itself. The Federation of Super-Earth had carelessly opened a wormhole using stolen Illuminate capability, that being dark fluid, and as a result of this mistake, they took that window of opportunity with what they had, and settled for herding the abominations as if they were some kind of cattle, and using them as their primary force. And of course, while they were working on that project, they also made significant advances in their vehicular technology, something which probably developed much faster. And so there it is, that's my theory for the voteless, and the overall state of the Illuminate, and it's the one that I'll be using as the basis for the rest of this video. It does have some plot holes, but at the very least stands on its own as an interesting concept. Now, with this experimentation, there probably came many failures, one of these likely being that humans aren't made up of enough matter to match the structure of the Illuminate, and so I assume that in an attempt to find a solution to this issue, the Illuminate tried merging multiple humans with this mutation. However, they didn't exactly lead to the most favorable result. However, it still found its own role in that of the flesh mob. Now, this abomination seems to be a combination of many humans that have been merged through some process, seemingly in an attempt to perfect the mutation. However, this seems to have gone wrong. Horribly wrong, making the flesh mob into less of a powerful being and more of a body horror movie antagonist. While we don't really pay much close attention to this thing when we're blowing it up with explosives, when we look at it up close like this, it's actually very gruesome. Aside from this reality, however, there is nothing really new about its appearance that hasn't already been said about the original voteless, as we've already covered things like the reason for their existence, the cell growth, the dense bone structure, and even the behavior, as it's almost identical. However, an interesting feature about the flesh mob is that it appears to have also included a cow in its creation. We see near the center of the flesh mob a gruesome fusion between two individuals and a cow, with the voteless flesh being thinly veiled over their skulls. The upper human had its ribcage fused with the top of the cow's skull, which has itself been merged with another human skull to its left. Additionally, in a pretty gruesome sight, coming from within the left skull, there is what I believe to be the same cow's tongue hanging out. Now, why there's a cow mixed in there, I have no idea, but I do have a few theories. As for why it could be there in the actual lore, I think it's either to see if including a cow's DNA and body structure with human DNA would produce a better result. Clearly not. And as for why it was actually designed this way, it was probably to play into the trope of aliens and flying saucers abducting cows and all. Assuming this was intentional, it's actually a pretty smart nod from the developers, in keeping with the part of the Illuminate's themes that invoke the classic flying saucer type of aliens. Overall, the flesh mob and the voteless as a whole are one of the most characterizing parts of the Illuminate forces. However, they are only one part of their thematic design, with the next being introduced in our next unit, the Watcher. Now we move on to the real marvels of Illuminate technology. The Watcher showcases this phenomena by having the ability to hover without any kind of real thruster. It really just floats around as a kind of drone, using some kind of possibly dark fluid-based technology. What's more is that most squid tech is seemingly biomechanical in nature. We see all Illuminate vehicles thus far bleed as they die, including the Watcher. This leads me to the the belief that all of these so-called vehicles are actually the same as the Watcher itself, being in a way drones, although for the sake of simplicity, after the Watcher I will be referring to them as vehicles. Now the Watcher itself is nothing extraordinarily special aside from its ability to float. It's a sleek marvel of engineering made from some kind of cement-like material. Obviously that's not what it really is, but when I look at the stuff Illuminate tech is made of, I just think of cement and stone, like marble. But if you can identify the precise material this is, please let me know in the comments. Aside from this, we can also notice a large variety of small details, such as there being not just one, but actually a wide array of 16 small lights around the big one, and some minor grooves along the sides of the main body that I'm not too sure the purpose of. They're probably related to some kind of aerodynamics. Now, of course, there's the main feature of the Watcher, the central light that it uses to search for hostile targets. At a distance, it appears to shine a purple rotating light at anything that it perceives as a hostile threat, which, of course, in this case is the Helldivers. I don't know why it needs this light, as even at night a Helldiver is pretty easily spottable, and it would be more effective to call in reinforcements without shining a giant light, but I suppose we could write it off as it needing absolute confirmation, or not having integrated night vision, or just something like that. Otherwise, there's nothing else special to be said about the Watcher. It's really just a floating piece of Illuminate technology, the creators of which we'll be getting to now as we finally reach the actual squith in the form of the Overseers. Now we finally observe the Overseers. They are described as centuries old, which of course implies that many of them remained from the First Galactic War. However, this poses an issue because the Overseers here seem to be biologically diverted from the way the original Illuminate looked. When we look at the First Galactic War's Apprentice and the other Illuminate units, the face is built like one large compound eye, being a kind of cyclops. However, modern-day Overseers seem to have developed heads, necks, and a slimmer frame. The reason for this is as of yet unknown. However, many theorize that the Illuminate went through rapid evolution during their absence, which is a possibility, but of course unconfirmed, as we don't really know if they went through the necessary selective pressures to undergo such an occurrence. Another proposed theory is that the Illuminate, using their biotechnology, extensively augmented themselves to the point where they began to appear like a different species. This is supported by the fact that the Overseers' armor is seemingly fused directly with their flesh. However, it again has no direct in-game confirmation. As for the appearance of the Overseer itself, it, as I mentioned, has plates of armor fused into it. When this armor is stripped off, I believe we see the Overseer's bare flesh and no skin. Initially, I'd assumed that this was actually its skin, due to the appearance of the squith in Helldivers 1. However, the Illuminate leaks have since proved otherwise. The Illuminate body structure is seemingly somewhat like an exoskeleton. In fact, it shares a great appearance with the xenomorph of all things, with a bunch of patterns across its flesh reminiscent of H.R. Geiger's work. The purpose of these is unknown to me. As one would expect, we aren't really that aware of the specifics of internal Illuminate biology. However, I can assume that these are the markings of some kind of veins or arteries, and, of course, the structure of their muscles. Now, based on the appearance of the Overseer's muscles and the fact that they literally bleed the color, we can assume that purple or blue is the natural color of blood in the squith species. And of course, in the wild, we find that blue blood, or hemolymph, occurs most naturally in marine invertebrates. This is due to the presence of copper containing a protein called hemocyanin. As the process goes with hemoglobin, hemocyanin will turn a certain color when bonded with oxygen, blue in this case. This is a nice detail to show that they originate from a marine environment, and also a detail that we'll be expanding on later. Moving on to their armor, it's seemingly made from the same material that the Watcher is made from, with a variety of attachments and augments to improve this suit. This may support a theory of Overseers being significantly modified squith units, and the overall idea of the squids being a biotechnological race at this point. Among the many modifications, we see some kind of tubes between the squid's thigh and calves, one at each of their shoulders, one going from their biceps to their forearms, and lastly, a bunch of tube-like structures around its neck. I'm not too sure of the purpose of these. They may be used in some way to power the Overseer's armor or shield, or they could just be a property of their armor as a whole. Another kind of modification that we see in its armor are these little joint things that imply that something has been injected or implanted into the Overseer's flesh. While we can't exactly see it with the torso because it causes too much damage when the armor is removed, we see that when the leg armor of the Overseer is removed, we see some kind of indent in its flesh. I assume that these are some kind of implants that enhance the Overseer's physical ability, as they are positioned at somewhat important locations for physical activities. What's more is we see a large bar of the same color at the center of the Overseer's back, the purpose of which I am completely unaware of. Finally, a nice feature of the parts of the Overseer that are more heavily armored is that they have some kind of different material making up some parts, and presumably the underlayer of all parts of the armor. What this other material is currently unknown. Now, the Overseers have a host of technologies that they use for personal defense. One of these weapons being what the Helldivers wiki alone has dubbed the Pathfinder Light Spear. This weapon seems to work on some kind of magnetic force, where the center attracts the two bludgeon pieces but also slightly repels them so that they remain a certain distance from the center. Ordinarily, the Overseers will simply use this end to bludgeon any threats. However, this weapon is also capable of firing a plasma projectile that can penetrate through some heavy armors. Aside from this though, there is a variant of the Overseer that is dubbed the Elevated Overseer. This unit only has 3 new additions: a helmet, a new weapon, and of course a jetpack. The helmet follows a different and honestly cooler design that kind of calls to the design of Isaac's helmet in Dead Space. I assume that this helmet is of ceremonial value, but it could also contain something like an alternate user interface accounting for the increase in elevation. The weapon, which the Helldivers wiki alone has dubbed the Plasma Storm Rifle, uses ILLUMINATE technology to fire 7-round bursts of baseball-sized plasma projectiles, which, again, the Helldivers wiki alone states burn hotter than small stars. There's also the main jetpack, which seems to be composed of a power source and 2 thrusters. Interestingly, it also has the blue lines seen on the back of the standard Overseer, but much larger. This shows that the Overseer naturally has a power source built into its armor, and that the jetpack is in fact an extension to this power source. Despite this, the Elevated Overseer is much frailer than its standard counterpart, with 150 less health, and on top of that, it is very vulnerable as its jetpack can easily be targeted and blown up. Even with these limitations though, the Elevated Overseer is still known as one of the most annoying Illuminate enemies, primarily because it moves around a lot and it's really hard to hit with really any weapon at all. And if that wasn't enough, the Elevated Overseer will also spam grenades at Helldivers to blow them away every chance it gets, which, you know, isn't the greatest of experiences, but overall, it's really a mid-tier variant of the Overseer. It's not anything crazily special, it just happens to be very annoying to fight against. The other variant of the Overseer is called the Crescent Overseer. The only 2 additions that this one has is the ammo pack and what the Helldivers wiki has dubbed the Plasma Bombard. This is the heaviest weapon in the Overseer arsenal, with level 5 penetration. It will use this for 2 primary purposes, the first being as a mortar, as it will fire large explosive charges at a distance in order to suppress and kill Helldivers who they and their herds of voteless cannot reach. The other use for it is as close quarters defense. While it is a bit more dangerous, the Crescent Overseer will not hesitate to use its mortar device at close range. And finally, while I have not witnessed this firsthand, it is also said that these Overseers will straight up punch Helldivers that get just a bit too close. Now, you've probably noticed that up till now, I haven't really covered how all of these pieces of Illuminate tech work, and the reason for that is simply, we don't know. Of course, we are already aware of things like dark fluid and such, but we really can't say for sure if this is even used in most of these weapons. Some even speculate that the Illuminate operates with forces of the arcane as opposed to any kind of standard technology, although that is unlikely. If I were to speculate, I could compare the Illuminate weaponry to the weapons of the Covenant of Halo, which use magnets to shape plasma into bolts and fire it off, and the magnetic hammers that the Overseers use could support this. But ultimately, we have nothing directly confirmed with Arrowhead themselves, although at this point that can be said about most information here. Now, the Illuminate are a powerful force, and up till now, while we've seen our fair share of power, we haven't really gotten to what makes up the bulk of the Illuminate's lethality. That is, until now, as we move on to our next unit, the Harvester. The Harvester is an autonomous tripod with a single eye and a large energy shield. From its eye, it fires a blue beam that vaporizes everything in its way, presumably using similar methods as the elevated Overseer's plasma storm rifle. The legs themselves are actually built in a pretty interesting way. See, the Harvester has a shell which covers a layer beneath it which is one penetration level lower. This seems to work as an exoskeleton, which hints at the Harvester's biomechanical nature. In a way, being something like the Striders from Half-Life, they even bleed when shot. To protect from this, the Harvester will deploy a large shield that deflects all attacks for a limited amount of time, or until sufficiently damaged. Shield technology like this is pretty common with Illuminate units, being seen previously on the Overseer. In this case, however, we can clearly see what generates the shield, that being this crest-like structure in the Harvester's head. When this is destroyed, it will cease to generate any shielding at all, allowing it for it to be most effectively taken down. The purpose of this I do not know, as we have seen in both warp ships and Overseers that shields can be generated seemingly without a blatantly obvious source. However, we may assume that the Harvester is this way because of how powerful this shield really is, easily tanking all but Hellbomb level attacks. It also seems that this structure is somewhat linked to the Harvester's beam, at least according to the Helldivers wiki. I don't believe I've ever witnessed this firsthand, but the wiki claims that when part of a Harvester's head is destroyed, its beam will become far more powerful, as it apparently worked as some kind of stabilizer. Again, I can't confirm this, so do with that information what you will. Aside from the beam itself, the Harvester does have an ability that it can use assuming that there is a target near it that the beam cannot reach, that being what the Helldivers wiki has defined as the Tesla Ripper. Basically, the Harvester has one of those Illuminate lightning towers built into it. Whenever a Helldiver gets a little too close for comfort, it gets zapped, only being thwarted by Helldivers wearing arc-resistant armor. The Harvester was once the most dangerous Illuminate unit you could encounter. Anyone who fought on Calypso will tell you that much. However, in modern day, it has since been, quite literally, overshadowed by our next unit, the Stingray. The Stingray is one of the units that utilize the Illuminate hover technology similar to the Watcher. However, in this case, it is used to a much greater extent. Somehow, with a process done that includes some kind of field in these circles, the Stingray can soar through the skies and strafe any Helldivers that it spots. And I word that very deliberately, as I also believe the Stingray is an autonomous unit, as it also bleeds all over its body when damaged, rather than specifically from what seems to be a cockpit that particularly resembles a ribcage. The Stingray will strafe Helldivers using what the wiki has dubbed the Plasma Destructor gun pods, essentially just really powerful plasma weapons on the level of something like the autocannon. I believe the wiki calls them pods because, as we can see up close, they have the ability to fold closed and open, and because when they fire in bursts of plasma that run in a lane of their choosing. For some odd reason, the Stingray is designed to telegraph this lane. Of course, this is a balancing thing for the game, but tactically it makes no sense. Additionally, when you die to this telegraphed attack, you are completely disintegrated, which, as far as I know, doesn't happen in any other Illuminate weapons. This implies that the Stingray has a different weapon system than the rest. Overall, the Stingray is really not that complex of a unit, at least based on what we know, as it mostly operates on unexplainable technology anyway. However, we find that there is a lot more to say about our next and final unit, the Leviathan. The Leviathan is the largest active Illuminate unit that we've seen thus far, and subsequently the most dangerous. Now, it seems that this unit is made to resemble something like a trilobite, or more accurately, a member of the Xiphosaura order of arthropods. Now, while the trilobite may be the first image that comes into your head when you think of these guys, in truth, the last remaining member of this order is the horseshoe crab, which does somewhat share a resemblance with the Leviathan. We see that it's segmented in a way quite similar to the members of this order, and its shape somewhat similar. What most gives me this impression is its spade-shaped head, which also possesses a few important parts, the most prominent of which being what the wiki has dubbed the disintegration culverins. Each of these are equipped with a spotlight. However, this is more reasonable than a literal telegraph like the Stingray, as we could assume that considering that this is also an autonomous body, these partly double as eyes and may need built-in flashlights. However, they are not the primary optical appendages as it would be with something like the Strider in Half-Life, but instead they are secondary to the Leviathan's real eyes, a set of 4 at the very front which allow it to navigate airspace without crashing into buildings. These do somewhat resemble the eyes on the horseshoe crabs in most Xiphosaura body plans, and in keeping with that theme, it seems that these 2 holes on the sides here are also eyes. However, these in particular are compound eyes, verified by this horseshoe crab diagram. Aside from vision, we can infer that the Leviathan has what we would call an open circulatory system, or at least an analog to that system, where fluid in a cavity called the hemocell will bathe internal organs with oxygen. Because of this, there is no distinction between blood and interstitial fluid, and the combination of all this fluid is what we call hemolymph. And what's more, the horseshoe crab particularly uses a protein in its hemolymph called hemocyanin, which might sound familiar because it's actually the protein that turns bright blue when bonded with oxygen. That's right, it all ties together now. See, the horseshoe crab blood is in fact bright blue due to the presence of this protein, and the blood actually does have some, not much, but some applications in modern medicine. According to Maryland, like the state of literally just just Maryland, a protein in the blood of horseshoe crabs can be used to test certain drugs and medical devices for the presence of endotoxins. Now, I know I'm stretching here, but it could even be assumed that Permacura, the company that makes Super Earth stims, could even be in the business of harvesting Illuminate blood for medical applications using that protein, in a similar way to the bugs whose blood have applications in power being a kind of oil. I'm pretty sure this concept won't be explored as much though, as it has never been directly addressed and the bugs are really the main focus when it comes to the resource side of things. On the topic of blood, when we peel back the Leviathan's tank-level armor, we get absolute confirmation that this is a fully biomechanical specimen, with there being an absolute fusion of purple flesh and bright blue veins held together by rebar and wires. I really couldn't tell you about this thing's anatomy directly, as peeling back the armor disfigures the innards, but I could at the very least ascertain that something like arteries or the remains of vital organs can be seen around its midsection here and here when destroyed. Aside from any of that, all I can say that I notice on this thing is the variety of little prongs and appendages that I'm not sure the purpose of. I could assume that they are for something like noticing changes in the air or communicating with fellow drones, but aside from that, I have not ascertained a purpose for these. So, at the current moment, we don't know much about the appropriators as they have just been added. However, we can ascertain things like their main purpose, as they were first deployed when the Illuminate ventured to the planet Cece in order to set up exospires on it. These were ultimately linked to Illuminate historical sites and the Void. It seems that the precision needed for these operations of importance led the Illuminate to completely eliminate the utilization of the commonly seen voteless units, opting for only their own ranks, which is likely because this was more of a defensive operation for them than offensive, with having to defend their own exospires. Additionally, they didn't only make a specialized defense force through the form of the appropriators, but also an offensive force in the form of the mindless masses. Less of a sub-faction and more of a reorganization, mindless masses is simply to say it's the forces of the Illuminate that have no extra units like Crescent Overseers or Harvesters and Stingrays, and Mainly, it just has large amounts of voteless and flesh mobs. The development of these sub-factions and the mechs as well, which we'll get to later, seems to point towards the efforts that the Illuminate make to put more pressure on the forces of Super Earth, maybe even to distract us from their true endeavors in the void. Whatever the case, the inclusion of the newly added appropriators has led to units with, as usual, many interesting details, the first of which being the Obtruder. At its core, the Obtruder is a modified version of the Watcher. Upon observing its appearance, it's literally just a Watcher with renewed plating and wires wrapped all around it. We can also assume that the centerpiece was modified in a way that makes it fire bolts of plasma like standard Illuminate weaponry. The wires that entangle this unit seemingly allow for more power to be routed through the overall design, as firing entire bolts of plasma is obviously much more resource intensive than simply scanning the area. And other than that, there's really not much to say about the Obtruder, as it really is just a Watcher reskin, only differing internally. One more interesting fact is that its name, Obtruder, is based on the word obtrude, obviously, which means to make yourself known in a notably unpleasant way. Overall, it's a great addition to the Chafe units of Helldivers 2, and it's the main unit that converts this sub-faction of Illuminate into something far more similar to automaton battles, with the many projectiles rather than the hordes of the voteless that the Illuminate are usually known for. However, the removal of all the voteless really reduces the variation of the Illuminate faction as a whole. The next unit to be analyzed amends this issue. This unit is the Gatekeeper. The Gatekeeper is definitely the most outstanding unit added amongst the appropriators. It's essentially a piloted exoskeleton being controlled by an Illuminate overseer in the center. The cockpit is not only shielded by the limbs and the legs, but also a force field powered by tech similar to that which shields the warp ships and harvesters. We see the shield that covers the cockpit is based almost identically on the Harvester's shield, as it even has the same kind of shield generator, which can be targeted as a weak point to eliminate it faster than usual. In the cockpit itself, an Illuminate Overseer unit controls the arms in a similar fashion to many mechs depicted in media. Essentially, within the shield bubble, there's a seat and two smaller arms that the Overseer can manipulate, and in manipulating these arms, the actual arms of the mech will move corresponding to it. This piloting system is highly effective. While the Gatekeeper itself doesn't really move that often, we can see later in a variation that Overseers can become skilled in the application of this system, allowing them to charge forward at great speeds. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, as the Gatekeeper has two large, high fire rate plasma weapons bolstered by what appears to be power cells wired into the back of the gun. As per usual for plasma weapons, we can assume in a similar fashion to Halo plasma weaponry, it may take gas and phase change it into plasma before shaping that plasma into a bolt to be fired from the barrel. In this process, the cells here either supply the power needed for the phase change or contain the gas itself. Interestingly, on the back of the Gatekeeper has what appears to be vents or heat sinks on the back to avoid overheating. Assuming that's what they're used for, this is actually the first Illuminate vehicle to ever have this, and is a good indicator that the Illuminate are moving more in the direction of more powerful machines rather than actual biological units like the Leviathan. While this may be the case though, the Gatekeeper still follows biological principles, having limbs shaped kind of like bones. One of the most peculiar things I noticed about these limbs is the material that they're made out of. While we can be sure that the plating that covers the limbs is the same as the ablative chitin-like material that the rest of the Illuminate bio units use, under this plating the actual structure is made out of something new, appearing like a solid gold-colored metal. Of course, we can't assume that it's actual solid gold, as gold itself is dense, but quite soft, definitely lower than medium penetration. This seemingly has to be some kind of other metal capable of making lower calibers ricochet, which, as far as I know, gold is incapable of, even if it would maybe absorb the impact. With this, we can assume, as anyone would, that it's some kind of steel with a gold finish or paint job or something, although at this point it could be anything adjacent to that. Overall, the Gatekeeper is the centerpiece of the new update, it being the highly showcased mech that everyone's seen. However, There is an alternate version with properties that allow it to be the most dangerous, even above the Gatekeeper. This unit is the Veraciter. The Veraciter is the same kind of mech as the Gatekeeper, but without any kind of armor plating, giving us a better look at the gold-colored material. Overall, it's the same, with the main modulations being the lack of armor, the cannons being replaced with claws, and an alternate, possibly weaker shield system. The shield system in particular seems to be based on many smaller batteries instead of one large pylon structure. These flaws are not due to some kind of oversight, but actually due to the fact that this unit wasn't really made for combat in the first place. As we know, the appropriators were needed for the Illuminate archaeology operations going on in the ancient sites. The Veraciter is a result of these operations needing some kind of construction equipment. As sourced by the official Helldivers 2 Twitter, it's basically an overly complicated forklift, a vehicle used for the movement of objects, which is a little overcomplicated considering it's basically a whole mech when it could just be a forklift, but overall it's pretty effective in the combat department. While its limitations make it weaker in areas like resistance to damage, the lack of armor plating and weaker shields allow it to run quite fast, and its sharp claws allow it to cut through Helldivers easily. Most everything I've said about the Gatekeeper applies to the Veraciter as well. In fact, the Gatekeeper is likely to be a modified version of the Veraciter in the first place.